Putin had pinned his hopes for land superiority in Ukraine on steel-armored convoys, but now Swedish-made bonus shells are crushing that superiority. Fired from 35 kilometers away, they rise, scan, and silently collapse into the weakest point of the armor. So how does bonus break Russia's armored line? Ukrainian artillery officers on the front lines tried Javelin NLAW AT-2 mine lines, kamikaze drones, and even Soviet-era Krasnopol ammunition to stop Russian armored reinforcements. All of them worked to a certain extent. However, the problem of limited range and narrow target spectrum could not be solved. When you hit the first vehicle of a tank battalion, the convoy stops, the rear vehicles maneuver backwards and wait, and the crew, having gained time, throw smoke grenades and hide. At such moments, the entire classic anti-tank guidance chain is disabled. If you lose sight of the target, if the GPS guidance of the munitions deviates, or if the radar controlling the firing is defeated by atmospheric conditions, even if the first strike is successful, the second and third targets will have already left their positions. In other words, a momentary blind spot means missing the entire opportunity. The Swedish-made bonus tank round steps in precisely at this critical point, becoming the bane of Russian armored vehicles. It has quickly become the signature, beyond-the-range tank killer of the Ukrainian artillery. The bonus is not a conventional tank round. It is a small, floating reconnaissance killer platform carrying two-part smart submunitions. When the shell leaves the barrel, the classic NATO propellant charge provides a fixed ballistic trajectory up to 35 kilometers. Once the ascent phase is complete, the nose modest cover of the casing opens, and the two sub-discs separate via micro-explosions from the lateral thrust cartridges, deploying their mini-parachutes. The discs spin at 9 revolutions per second, beginning to scan the terrain below. One disc scans in a spiral pattern from left to right, while the other scans in a spiral pattern from right to left. Each disc houses an embedded electronic module containing an infrared matrix sensor, a LIDAR scanner, and a high-speed processor on its underside. The sensors first emit a heat signature to identify metal mass points by filtering out ambient noise, then use silhouette parameters to distinguish target types such as T-72, T-90, BMP-3, BTR-82, and Kamaz-based supply trucks. The algorithm only activates the explosive subtimer when it confirms that the detected target is an armored vehicle or a critical logistics transport vehicle. It automatically ignores worthless targets such as ordinary SUVs, pickup trucks, agricultural tractors, or piles of scrap metal. When the algorithm is triggered, the cast copper cone inside the projectile explodes in microseconds, flattening itself and creating an Arlington Silver Shield-type explosive shape charge. This penetrating warhead travels at a speed exceeding 2,000 kilometers per second at a right angle to the target. Even in the Russian army's most advanced tanks, such as the T-90M, the upper armor thickness generally does not exceed 45 millimeters of steel. Russia was able to distract waves of javelins and kamikaze drones with smoke mortars, but neither smoke nor cover is of any use against bonus, which selects its targets using vibrating LIDAR and infrared scanning. This level of armor is particularly vulnerable to threats from above. When the explosive charge of a munition like bonus strikes the target at a right angle, it penetrates the armor. The penetrating warhead reaches the munition rack or engine compartment beneath the armor, creating a high-pressure blast wave. This explosion disables the tank's internal systems. In most cases, the vehicle catches fire suddenly, or the crew loses consciousness due to the shock effect. The targeted armored vehicles are rendered combat ineffective due to both the risk of fire and the collapse of internal mechanisms. The entire process is completed within 25 to 30 seconds after the projectile leaves the barrel. The firing coordinates are determined not by the artillery radar, but by the disc's own learned dataset. Therefore, GPS jamming, GLONASS interference, or the Krastukha 4 electronic jamming system cannot access Bonus's decision algorithm. Ukraine first tested bonus ammunition in the fall of 2023 against a Russian armored column deployed near Toretsk in the Donetsk region. The target included 3 BMP-2 armored combat vehicles known for their weak upper armor. Footage recorded immediately after the attack showed that a new era had begun on the battlefield. The turrets of the BMP suddenly detached from the hull and flew into the air, while the upper hulls of the vehicles, now engulfed in flames, shattered like a can opened by an explosion. Each turret had an almost symmetrical circular hole in the center. With a diameter of 10 to 12 centimeters, this mark resembled a saucer, and was the sign of a kinetic attack that came not from the outside, but directly from above and at a right angle. The shrapnel scattered on the side panels documented the secondary damage caused by the lower munitions during the explosion. Analysts pointed out that only one system could leave such a mark, an EFP, which is targeted from above and uses a point-impact-shaped explosive. Shoulder-fired guided missiles such as the Javelin leave a wider conical damage pattern because they operate with a tandem warhead, while sub-munition systems such as Bonus rain down millimeter-sized death in confined spaces. Just 7 days after this first successful attempt, another Russian unit moving south of Svatove, in the north of the Luhansk Oblast, was targeted. This time, the target was a convoy of command vehicles, including BMP-3 armored personnel carriers and T-80 BVM tanks, one of the most advanced tanks in the inventory. Videos recorded by Ukrainian forces in the area during the attack revealed a critical fact. There was no drone footage or incoming missile trail. Cameras only managed to capture the sudden appearance of umbrella-like explosions from above, which embedded themselves into the metal hull within seconds and detonated. At that point, French sources quietly conveyed the message. Along with the deployed Caesar batch, we also sent a limited number of bonus units. In December 2024, the Swedish government announced a $295 million aid package. The delivery list included 48 Archer self-propelled howitzers along with multi-purpose precision 155mm ammunition. Notes leaked to the Stockholm Defense Committee stated that Archer batteries will be packaged with at least 1,000 bonus munitions. Following this, the signatures on the front lines continued to increase. The Oryx team, which collects Russian armored statistics, added the phrases vertical penetration from above, high temperature traces, internal explosion to 41 of the 176 tanks destroyed in the first 5 months of 2025, and marked a significant portion of these as having been hit by bonus. Russia tried to launch a classic counter-battery process against bonus. By the time the Zoopark 1M radars tracked the launch trail of the howitzer rocket and found its firing range, Caesar or Archer had already changed positions. This is because both platforms retract their hydraulic struts in 40 seconds after firing and can retreat 500 meters. By the time Zoopark's second radar scanned, the new bonus missile was already in the air. Due to its low wavelength heat signature and the fact that it does not require GPS coordinates at the start of its ballistic trajectory, the Murmansk BN and Krasuka 4 jammer networks were ineffective. The sensor's remaining disk fragment makes its own decision using its internal computer and does not rely on external signals. The EPOHA hard kill active protection package has been tested on T-90Ms since the summer of 2024. But EPOHA cannot find the right angle to hit the EFP coming from above. The radar antenna is on the side of the hull. The projectile approaching the turret roof appears and strikes in 0.2 seconds, and the APS cannot fire at a top-down range. Every active system they use, such as Afghanit or Arena-M, has side-front-rear approach sensors and cannot trigger kinetic countermeasures in vertical strikes. Reactive armor plates cannot be installed due to the weight and ergonomics of the tank roof. The situation is even more dire for armored personnel carriers. The BMP-3's roof is 15 millimeters thick, and the BTR-82's is 7 millimeters thick. EFP rounds slice through them like butter. Bonus's logistics also give Kiev a significant advantage. The 155 millimeters NATO artillery line is available in Ukraine, with the M777 and Archer, and the Danish-Norwegian-German-made PZH-2000 is ready in friendly countries. Since a bonus round is standardized in the supply chain, it doesn't matter which country it's shipped from, and the firing structure doesn't matter whether it's Caesar or Archer. The cost per round is around $110,000. If 3 rounds destroy 2 tanks and 1 armored recovery vehicle, Russia's loss exceeds $5 to $6 million. The cost multiplier is in favor by a factor of 15 to 20. Ukraine has once again defied expectations. One of Russia's most critical supply lines has been struck from an unexpected direction. 800 kilometers away, far from the front lines, the supply chain crossing the Caspian Sea has collapsed. The target was a cargo ship loaded with Shahed-type kamikaze drones from Iran. A single hit, a single ship. But the impact threatens the entire supply line. How did Ukraine manage to open Russia's most heavily guarded rear door? On August 14th, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces carried out a precision drone strike on the port of Olya in the Astrakhan Oblast. This attack was not merely a tactical maneuver, but a direct strategic message aimed at the heart of Russia's military cooperation with Iran. The port of Olya is no ordinary shipping point. It serves as the back door through which unmanned aerial vehicles, ammunition, and ballistic missile parts from Iran enter Russia, effectively keeping Moscow's lifeline open. The attack carried out at this point represents the first direct intervention in a supply line that Russia has considered critical throughout the war. The target of the attack was the port Olya 4, a cargo ship 400 feet long and weighing 4,900 gross tons. The ship is registered as part of Russia's state-linked MG Flot shipping network and is on the US Treasury Department's sanctions list. According to a statement by Ukrainian intelligence, the ship was carrying parts and ammunition specifically prepared for Shahid-type kamikaze drones from Iran. Among these parts were not only standard electronic components but also warheads, altitude and flight control systems, guidance sensors, and, according to claims, some ballistic missile components. Therefore, the target was not merely a cargo ship, but a logistical lifeline and strategic supply route fueling Russia's air attack capabilities. This attack also demonstrated that the port of Olya was much more than just a logistics center in technical terms, but rather the physical embodiment of the Iran-Russia military alliance. These systems, transported from Tehran via the Caspian Sea, had become one of the critical pillars of Russia's offensive capabilities on the front lines in recent months. Moreover, the attack was carried out approximately 800 kilometers away from the front line. This distance falls within a zone long considered an absolutely secure area in Russian military doctrine, where defense reflexes are low and radar coverage is weak. However, Ukraine has gradually dismantled this doctrinal comfort zone over the past 2 years. It identified radar vulnerabilities, tested air defense gaps, and created attack windows to disrupt Russia's reflex systems. The strike on Olya was one of the most striking examples of this process. Initial reports from the field indicated that Port Olya 4 was directly hit while moored at the pier. After being hit, the ship sank to the waterline, with extensive burn marks observed, particularly on the superstructure and the captain's bridge. OSINT shares indicated that the burn marks were concentrated on the superstructure and that images consistent with the point of impact were received. Although the extent of the damage has not yet been fully determined, this incident has been recorded as the first direct blow to Russia's supply chain through the Caspian Sea. International Maritime Security Company Ambri also confirmed the attack and stated that it was the first direct attack on a commercial vessel in the Caspian Sea basin by Ukraine. Another notable aspect of the operation is its timing. The attack coincided with the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska, which caused a huge public outcry. The Kiev administration positioned this coincidence as a direct message. Moscow's war plans via Iran will not be tolerated, and Russia's strategic comfort on the rear front will be disrupted. Ukrainian sources emphasized that the operation was carried out through joint planning between special operations forces and military intelligence units, and that the aim of the attack was to disrupt Iranian military shipments. The geopolitical significance of this attack stems from the fact that the Caspian Sea is a closed area for navies other than those of the Caspian Five. The 2018 Aktau Agreement clearly states that only the armed forces of littoral states are permitted in the Caspian Sea and prohibits the deployment of third-country forces. This legal framework transforms the Caspian Sea into a security geography distinct from open sea areas, making any attempt to exert influence on military targets in the region from afar even more noteworthy. Olya is located at the Volga-Caspian estuary in Russia's Astrakhan region and is defined as a critical node at the northern end of the international north-south transport corridor. Russian and regional sources highlight plans to increase the capacity of Olya and Astrakhan ports under the INSTC and expand their logistical functions through special economic zone status. The Volga-Don and Volga-Caspian waterways connect Olya to the Azov Black Sea, Baltic and Caspian networks via Russia's inland waterways, but continue to face constraints such as seasonality, shallowness and lock capacity. The Caspian Policy Center and other analyses have documented that Iranian-Russian military and supply traffic on the Caspian route has resorted to methods such as AIS manipulation, blackouts, and multiple STS transfers to avoid sanctions and monitoring mechanisms. General staff data revealed that ports and terminals accounted for a significant share of total successful strikes during Ukraine's deep strike campaign throughout 2025. Russia once again relied on its armor, but this time it faced not just a defensive line, but a calculated ambush. A massive Russian armored convoy of 71 vehicles was advancing toward Siversk. Inside were tanks, armored personnel carriers, motorcycle reconnaissance units, and fast strike teams. All were deployed to the battlefield, but Russian commanders failed to account for one thing. The 54th and 81st Brigades were waiting exactly where they were supposed to be. What happened next? On July 27th, Russian forces had gathered near the village of Verkhnokhamyanka. 6 T-72B3M tanks, arranged in 3 rows, 3 BMP-2 armored personnel carriers, 6 MT-LB tracked tractors, 1 BEM recovery vehicle, 2 light buggies, and 12 pickup trucks linked together began moving forward. 41 motorcycles were also at the rear of the convoy. The Russian convoy's intention was to launch a surprise attack towards Zolotarivka, first catching the Ukrainian defense off guard, then pushing back the western flank surrounding Siversk. But this time, they were not facing an ordinary defense line. Ukraine's 54th Mechanized Brigade and 81st Airborne Brigade had been preparing in the area for weeks. The convoy's route had been identified beforehand, and a series of drone surveillance points and artillery coordination networks had been set up in the area. The 54th Brigade had been defending this front, which had seen some of the fiercest fighting in the region since 2022. They knew the terrain and the enemy's habits like the back of their hands. The 81st Brigade, meanwhile, was renowned for its rapid response, high mobility, and flanking maneuvers. 2 T-64BV tanks from the 81st Air Assault Brigade approached the northern edge of the riverbed and took up positions in the shade. An M113 armored ambulance was parked beside them. As soon as the Russian convoy emerged from the tree line, reconnaissance drones had already taken up positions on the hilltop. As soon as movement was detected, the first salvo arrived with 155mm artillery fire. The Ukrainian tank commander then locked onto a sudden heat signature detected by his thermal imaging system. About 90 meters away, a Russian armored vehicle was slowly emerging from between the trees. Its hull was heavily reinforced with anti-drone grills. This was a T-72B3 with improvised armor enhancements. To protect the approximately 46-ton T-72 and its 3-person crew, the grills were welded to the upper structure, along with additional steel panels. The armor protection was reinforced with composite armor and Contact 5 explosive reactive armor systems. While this reinforcement aimed to protect it from airborne FPV attacks, this time death would come not from the sky, but from the barrel of the opposing gun. The Ukrainian sniper quickly made his calculations. The T-64BV's 125mm gun was loaded with a heat round. The Russian tank's blind spot was the dome area at the rear left, where there was no armor reinforcement. After a moment of silence, the trigger was pulled. The shell struck the Russian tank's upper structure, directly beneath the turret. At the moment of the explosion, the turret was thrown aside, and the turret itself jumped half a meter upward. However, the fatal blow was not this. Despite the severe shock, the vehicle managed to maneuver backward by forcing its engine. The damage was critical, but the crew was still inside. The Russian tank could only reach a speed of 50 kilometers per hour on the difficult terrain. The Ukrainian drones, however, were much faster. Within minutes, the drone team lying in ambush on the hilltop released an FPV drone loaded with explosives. The drone flew over the trees and headed toward the Russian tank in the burning forest. It embedded itself in the rear armor and exploded. This second blow ignited the fuel tank. The T-72B3 turned into a ball of flames. Since the ammunition was being transported openly in the automatic loader inside the tank, the fire could not be extinguished. In the panic, some vehicles tried to retreat but became stuck in the narrow path within the forest. FPV drones were waiting for this opportunity. Kamikaze drones, first targeting the tank turrets and then the engine blocks of the BTRs, shattered the armored line within minutes. However, Ukraine's plan did not end there. The convoy had been stopped. Now it was time for destruction. the 81st Brigade's light infantry units launched an attack along the armoured line at a three-quarter angle. At this point in the battle, the Russian side's plan should have been to gain momentum. They couldn't do that either. The reason was the breakdown of logistics. The Brem recovery vehicle accompanying the convoy was preparing to tow the first damaged tank when two more FPVs closed in on it. The driver's door was shattered, and the crane operator was injured. With no team left to rescue the tank, the convoy's speed dropped once again. Thus, the Russian soldiers, surrounded from the sides and rear, were left defenseless in open terrain. They were not given the opportunity to reposition themselves through quick maneuvers and coordinated fire. Russian infantry disembarking from transport vehicles encountered mini-mortar fire, automatic rifles, and homemade explosives before they could even dig in. Some armoured vehicles were abandoned in the forest because their equipment had malfunctioned or the crew had been lost. Just a few minutes after the fighting began, at least 5 Russian tanks lined up side by side in an open area at the edge of the forest caught fire simultaneously. All that remained were thick black smoke, the echoes of exploding ammunition, and intertwined piles of metal. Tank turrets were hurled meters away. Some vehicles' ammunition depots exploded from within. Within the first 45 minutes, at least 20 armoured vehicles were rendered inoperable by coordinated fire from Ukrainian artillery and FPV drone teams. Tanks, BMP-2s, armoured personnel carriers and most motorised units were either destroyed by fire or abandoned. Russian units attempting to advance along the narrow forest strip, now under a no-fly zone, were repeatedly detected and subjected to sudden fire. Satellite imagery clearly revealed extensive burn marks, ammunition fragments, and traces of secondary explosions at various points in the area. Tree trunks remained charred and broken, while the ground was littered with craters caused by large-caliber artillery shells. The number of Russian military vehicles left behind after the battle was staggering. Only one BREM armoured recovery vehicle, one MTLB personnel carrier, and one truck remained operational. They were later withdrawn from the area while being monitored by Ukrainian surveillance drones. According to initial estimates, 48 Russian soldiers were neutralized at the scene, while 69 others were injured to varying degrees. Most of the wounded were either pulled from the rubble or found defenseless near the exploding vehicles. Even the basic numbers of this clash demonstrated how the war economy had been turned upside down. Russia is a country at war, but it is not only fighting against Ukraine, it is also fighting within itself. The economy has hit rock bottom, and the resources to cover the costs of the war have been exhausted. Soldiers on the front lines are struggling to find food, and shortages of ammunition and equipment are growing. Russians are now on the brink of a major uprising, saying enough is enough. While the Kremlin is turning to exploiting even the poorest regions to fill the budget, growing unrest in the streets is turning into rebellion. Explosions are not just lighting up Moscow's skyline, but also burning television screens miles away. In Rostov, angry mothers set fire to the military commissariat. In Kazan, protests against electricity price hikes turned into "No to War" slogans. And in Dagestan villages, a flood of coffins triggered calls for autonomy. Even the refrigerators of the low-income class in Buryatia have been seized by the army. The situation is that dire, and this is pushing Russia into the darkest period of its modern history. The deafening sound of sirens echoing across the country is no longer connecting the Kremlin to the streets. It is connecting the streets to each other. Every alarm sounds like a drumbeat of rebellion. Every explosion further eroding the myth of the invincible state. Where will this chain of collapse break? In the 8th month of 2025, the Kremlin budget had a deficit of 3.7 trillion rubles. This figure represents a budget gap of a magnitude almost unheard of in Russian financial history outside of times of war. As the cost of the war in Ukraine rises with each passing month, military spending is skyrocketing. Energy revenues are declining due to global price fluctuations and sanctions. The ruble, meanwhile, cannot stop its decline in value. Thus, Moscow's coffers are emptying rapidly, struggling to bear the burden of the war. The Kremlin's solution to close this gap has been to reach into the pockets of citizens at the lowest levels of society. Buryatia, one of Siberia's poorest regions, already has a fragile socio-economic structure with low income levels, limited production capacity, and high unemployment rates. But in recent weeks, local authorities and volunteer networks have launched campaigns to collect supplies directly from the public to support the army. Announcements made in the Zagrayevsky region requested donations of refrigerators to be sent to field hospitals at the front lines. However, the list of requests quickly expanded to include basic humanitarian needs, such as motorcycles, clothing, wheelchairs, canes, and even drinking water. A small number of people voluntarily handed over their remaining working refrigerators and other usable items. But this scene attracted attention not only because of the material aid it provided, but also because of the message it conveyed. Local residents interpret the state and military's inability to meet even the most basic logistical needs with their own resources as a sign of deep failure in both economic management and war preparedness. The situation in Buryatia is being replicated almost exactly in other regions of Russia. In Irkutsk, the local administration suspended bonus payments to a wide range of people, from teachers to cultural workers, public officials and educators, and transferred these funds directly to the army's needs. Although official statements say that these cuts are temporary, there is talk behind the scenes that they could continue indefinitely. A teacher's account clearly illustrates the scale of the situation. They said there was no money left for the SWO, that all resources had been exhausted. Since soldiers couldn't be paid, they deducted a significant amount from our salaries. In the Komi Republic, demands have taken a different turn. Authorities have requested that the public donate fishing nets to be sent to the front lines. It is stated that soldiers will use these nets to cover trenches, build temporary shelters, or provide camouflage. Thus, the assistance requested from the public is not limited to basic needs such as food or clothing. It extends to engineering and defense materials that will be used directly on the battlefield. At Bauman State Technical University in Moscow, the impact of the war economy has manifested itself in a more creative but equally controversial way. The university administration has offered students physical education credits in exchange for knitting camouflage nets. This practice amounts to a direct exchange of academic achievement for the production of war materials. Thus, the needs of the front lines are now being met not only by factories or volunteer workshops, but also by university campus curricula. What is striking is that the increasing economic and social pressures have completely transformed the public's motivation to donate. Those who enthusiastically supported the invasion of Ukraine in the early stages of the war and sent money to the front lines had increased their donations nearly fourfold by 2025. But this time, the driving force was not Kremlin propaganda, but the harsh conditions and humanitarian concerns faced by soldiers on the front lines. In other words, the purpose of donations has become less about supporting a political cause and more about helping relatives, friends, or neighbors survive. However, even this voluntary aid is far from solving the deepening problem. The people see that the cost of the war is constantly being placed on their shoulders as their living standards rapidly decline. Prices for everything from basic food items to transportation are rising, while wages are eroding in real terms. Public services such as health and education are deteriorating, and transportation infrastructure is crumbling. This situation is fueling growing silent anger and unrest, especially in low-income areas. Moreover, this anger is not solely driven by material concerns. Mothers who send their children to war also bear the heavy burden of financing this war. In Dagestan, where soldiers' funerals followed one after another, meetings were held under the banner of local autonomy, and the issue was quickly brought to the official agenda of the regional parliament. In Tatarstan, an imam said in his sermon, "If the capital declares war and sends the bill to the peasants, this is not justice." As a result, an investigation was launched against him by the Ethnic Policy Committee. Every time budget allocations are cut, discontent grows in the provinces. When the center's power weakens, the periphery becomes reluctant to recognize authority. The anger on the streets erupted in Novosibirsk at the end of July. 3,800 people who participated in the Enough is Enough march were dispersed within the first 15 minutes by water cannons firing colored water. Memorial chains were formed in 19 cities with black balloons in their hands and the slogan, "Give me back my son," on their lips. In Perm, Crowds protesting a 25% increase in the price of bread quickly switched to chanting "No to war." Police offered those arrested two options: a fine of 600,000 rubles or voluntary deployment to the front lines. Finding men without passports in the city was nearly impossible. Most had left the country months earlier via Georgia or Kazakhstan. The losses were no longer just statistics, they had become a pain deeply embedded in people's homes. According to independent sources, the number of Russian soldiers killed, seriously injured, or missing between February 2022 and July 2025 reached 1.05 million. This meant that 1 in every 4 households in the country had a black ribbon hanging from their door. According to a report by demographer Pavel Yelizarov, between 970,000 and 1,040,000 soldiers had completely lost their combat effectiveness during the same period. While official figures still insisted on 45,000 casualties, the reality of the graves was undeniable. The Independent Civil Initiative last address identified 132,000 new military grave markers ordered between April and June, based on data from marble workshops. This equated to an average of 1,450 deaths per day. Local newspapers in villages now print obituaries on extra pages, while in cities the question, "Why the war?" is spray-painted on neighborhood walls. While state television broadcast headlines about heroic defenders of the homeland, mothers on telegrams still whispered the same words. The zinc box arrived, we couldn't see his face. Nevertheless, 350,000 people were called up in an accelerated draft to make up for the new losses. But the confirmed number did not even reach 50,000. Instead of long queues in front of the provincial police headquarters, there are silent voids. Young people rush from the passport line to the Georgian border, the Mongolian steppe, or the Helsinki bus station. According to reports, over the past 9 months, 310,000 conscripts have crossed the borders of Georgia, Finland, Kazakhstan, and Turkey, illegally. Mobile border data shows that 22% of Russian citizens intend to leave the country. It is now the norm for families to wait at the door with their passports, cash, and digital wallets at the ready. An anonymous report from border guards says that over 120,000 people have declared their intention to leave the country permanently since the end of May. This brings the total number of war refugees to 1.3 million. The defense industry cannot find workers to replace the young men who have left, leaving production lines idle. The official unemployment rate still stands at just 7.3%, but this figure masks the employment illusion created by the war. The recruitment of military contract personnel has topped the list of most sought-after professions in Russia's open labor market database for the first time. Salary promises of up to 500,000 rubles are splashed across posters to lure young people from poor regions into the barracks. But for those who know the truth, these advertisements are often synonymous with two signs seen side by side on the same street. One is a banner recruiting soldiers, the other is an advertisement for a coffin manufacturer. In the civilian sector, the picture is even bleaker. The disruption of the supply chain for Western technology components has crippled production. In the past month alone, 1,100 medium-sized factories have closed down. The 68,000 people laid off in the automotive sector formed long lines in front of tax offices. Applications for temporary social credit hit a record high. The consumer front is also experiencing a severe downturn. In the neighborhood markets of the Leningrad Oblast, the price of a kilogram of potatoes has reached 90 rubles. Pensioners are calculating whether they can afford to buy bread when they go to the pharmacy to get their prescription drugs. The subsidized smart credit card project, which the government has begun to talk about, is being described as a QR code version of the coupon books of the 1990s. The crisis is not limited to income and consumption. The country's skilled human resources are also rapidly dwindling. Since the beginning of June, 47 rural health centers have hung signs saying, "Temporarily closed," due to a shortage of doctors. In some areas, the nearest dental clinic is 300 kilometers away, and a farmer writhing in toothache expresses his anger, saying, "Did I not have my teeth pulled to win the war?" Middle-class families are paying large sums of rubles to consulting firms operating along the Turkey-Armenia-Serbia route to send their children abroad. Demographic indicators are revealing one of the harshest reflections of social collapse. The birth rate dropped by 7% in 2024, In the first quarter of 2025, the decline reached 12%. Reports from maternity clinics confirm that expectant mothers are unwilling to raise children in an environment of economic uncertainty and social unrest. Thus, the economic crisis is quietly consuming not only the present, but also the future of the country. The wave of emigration is no longer just the desperate flight of the poor. The richest segment of the country is also quietly packing their bags. As always, the elite made the first move. Oligarchs are withdrawing their assets from Russia by transferring them to Dubai-based offshore trusts. In the last 3 months, $15 billion has fled abroad unregistered. Luxury villas in Rublevka have fallen to half their price on real estate portals, but the market is still frozen. No one wants to tie their fortune to a house burning with rubles. The central bank is issuing warning after warning saying, "You are disrupting the balance of payments." But these warnings are not affecting the appetite of law firms or the determination of buyers. Deals are being struck behind the scenes, synchronized with private jet departure times. In the corridors of the capital, the same phrase is being whispered more and more frequently. If the ruble hits 160, even those who stayed will start looking for tickets. But after the attacks in June, 117,000 passports were issued in just 1 month. Queues of vehicles at the Georgian border crossed 35 kilometers. Kazakhstan limited entries by imposing quotas on authorization visas. Even Armenia began discussing a cap on temporary residence applications on the grounds of preserving the male population balance. Andrei, 28, who left Barnaul, explained his decision in a short video posted on YouTube. "If I stay here, there are 2 possibilities, the front or prison. Exile is expensive, but if there is a price to pay for survival, I have chosen to pay it." All these developments are severely eroding the political image that Vladimir Putin has worked so hard to cultivate over the years. This is because Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine, which began in 2022, was presented as a historic mission and rebirth of the nation, thanks to the Kremlin's skillful propaganda in the early days. Victory songs were played on state television and Russian flags waved in the squares. But as time passed, the cost of the war became visible both on the front lines and within the country. As months turned into years, ammunition shortages, losses of armored vehicles and drones, and even the inability to provide basic medical supplies dealt a direct blow to Putin's image as an invincible leader. The collection of refrigerators, motorcycles, blankets, and even drinking water from the people in poor areas, and the forcing of university students in large cities to weave camouflage nets in exchange for tuition credits, led to questions about the state's military capacity. While Western media outlets have documented Russia's bottleneck in high-tech weapon systems and spare parts crisis due to Western sanctions, images leaked on social media have spread rapidly among the public, despite the Kremlin's strict control mechanisms. Once seen as the guarantor of stability and order, Putin now faces criticism as a leader who cannot even equip his own army. This erosion of his image is narrowing the Kremlin's room for maneuver in domestic politics. As the living standards of the people are rapidly declining, the financial burden of the war is increasing day by day. Although this situation does not directly translate into victory for Ukraine, it does create a significant strategic advantage. Disruptions in the logistics chain on the front lines are eroding the Russian army's ability to carry out planned offensives and defenses. Ammunition supplies are delayed, armored units are immobilized while waiting for spare parts, and health and ammunition depots behind the front lines cannot be adequately supplied. The shortfall in the Kremlin's war budget is raising questions about its ability to finance long-term operations. This is buying Ukraine time and giving it the opportunity to use military and financial aid from the West in a more planned and effective manner. The Kremlin now has 2 remaining weapons: fear and the currency. Fear is fueled by tightened laws, police pressure, detentions, and long prison sentences, while the currency is temporarily managed by the central bank's reflex to print money. But both tools are like time bombs. The more fear is suppressed, the greater the pressure builds within society. The ruble's printed fuel inflation, and the money in people's pockets rapidly loses value. State television may say that everything is under control, but the empty shelves in supermarkets and constantly changing price tags send a clear message to citizens on the street: out of control. Air raid sirens have become a psychological barometer, measuring the country's mood. Each alarm sounds like a hammer blow, eroding the ruble further and adding new cracks to the wall of people's patience. The fear fueled by the Kremlin's stick policy is backfiring like a chemical reaction. History has shown this cycle many times. In 1993, Yeltsin built fear by attacking parliament with tanks. But when the economy collapsed, that fear evaporated. Today, the economy is already evaporating, so the life of fear is much shorter. Russian history books contain the phrase, "The Russian uprising is a powerful phenomenon." But the picture for 2025, rather than whispering its meaning, screams it out loud. Bread is expensive, children are in the grave, the ruble is worthless, and drone sirens can be heard day and night. And past examples clearly show the outcome of this formula. In 1905, the first revolutionary uprising was suppressed with blood, but 12 years later, the empire collapsed. In 1989, the human chain of the Baltic peoples was isolated, but 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, that chain is being rebuilt in any square with the screams of a mother, the rebellion of a soldier fleeing the front lines, and the rumble of hunger. The only difference this time is that the chain is breaking faster than ever before in history. What do you think about this? Your thoughts are very important to us, so please leave your comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Ukraine has cut off Russia's oil supply. Critical centers of the Druzhba pipeline have been shaken by attacks. This pipeline supplies Belarus and from there, Europe. Now the oil is not flowing, refineries are burning, and Moscow's energy bargaining is beginning to collapse. Lukashenko has sounded the alarm while the Kremlin is helpless. Are these attacks the emergence of a new front within Russia or the beginning of its disintegration? On the night of August 12-13, unmanned aerial vehicles carried out attacks on Russian oil refinery facilities. The coordinates point to Unecha in the Bryansk Oblast. This is not just a simple valve, but one of the largest nodes in the Druzhba network. This node is crucial for flows to the Mozyr and Novopolotsk refineries in Belarus. The European branch is also fed from here and connects to the Baltic outlets via BPS-2. The annual capacity is high, estimated at approximately 60 million tons. Therefore, a single fireball could simultaneously disrupt the supply chains of multiple countries. When a node is hit, which country will be the first to feel the impact? Belarus, Russia, or Europe? Initial reports from the field are unclear. Explosions and flashes were reported throughout the night. NASA firm's data showed heat points during the same time frame. The coordinates pointed to the station site, and the brightness values were consistent with the presence of a fire. This provided an independent layer confirming the severity of the incident. From Minsk's perspective, the issue goes beyond a technical malfunction. Mozyr and Naftan receive most of their crude oil via this pipeline. Following repeated attacks on Russian refineries, Belarusian facilities have become critical for supplying products to the domestic market and neighboring countries. Maintaining diesel and gasoline supply rhythms is crucial for Belarus to ensure domestic price stability and avoid political costs. Any disruption at Unecha puts pressure on refinery planning and cash flow. Will there already be queues at Belarusian fuel stations, or will the system absorb the demand? The picture on the flow front is divided. European buyers report that delivery schedules are continuing. This suggests that the western branch is being managed in the short term through bypasses and pressure management. There is no clear confirmation of a complete shutdown for the Belarusian branch. However, repeated disruptions could trigger fluctuations in flow rates and delays in quality control. Russia also implemented security measures in the Volgograd region on the same night. Airport operations were restricted, and explosions were reported near a petroleum facility. This simultaneous pressure strategy is challenging repair and intervention teams. Firefighting, pressure reduction, and restart cycles can be prolonged. Repeated shocks are rapidly depleting the pool of spare parts and expert personnel. As Belarus's risk increases, can Russia's repair pace keep up with this cycle? The Druzhba network's design tolerates short-term fluctuations. Bypass lines, valve configurations, and pressure staging routines are in place for this purpose. However, this flexibility is not unlimited. Repeated impacts on critical nodes reduce tolerance. Operators eventually reduce flow rates, alter shift rhythms, and advance maintenance intervals. The cost of this for the Belarusian economy is invisible but tangible. Mozyr and Naftan must update their load plans. Intermediate storage times via tank farms change. If raw material acceptance windows narrow, product output and contract flows are affected. This creates short-term pressure on cash flow and tax revenues. When the refinery schedule is delayed, how quickly does the price at the pump fluctuate? The discrepancy between field findings and official statements reflects the nature of the uncertainty. Regional authorities claim the fire has been extinguished. The company is delaying the technical report. European buyers are pointing to the current plan. The Kiev front, however, describes UNECHA as a military economic hub and emphasizes the logic of a deep strike. This divergence shows that it is wrong to reduce the assessment to a binary choice of cut or not cut. A more accurate question would be, how much has the system been worn down, and which part will break under the next blow? The correct metrics are also different from Belarus's perspective. Station head pressure values, flow deviations, quality flow reports at the Belarus exit, and refinery shift schedules. These indicators produce more reliable signals than panic rhetoric. When will the real risk in Belarus become visible in numbers? The picture is clear at the operational level. If a fire breaks out at a pumping station, the units that go offline must be transferred to backup. During this time, the overall pressure at the station drops, the fuel flow fluctuates, and the day-night shift schedule is redrawn. Even if the European branch continues that day, the Belarus branch will experience minor disruptions. If these disruptions grow in a chain reaction, product plans will be disrupted. The new phase of the energy war is about choosing nodes, hitting the focal points that control the flow instead of a random valve on the pipeline multiplies the cost. UNECHA falls under this category. With BPS-2, it can also affect flows near the Baltic exits. In the Belarus direction, it is positioned to disrupt the crude oil intake rhythm of Mozyr and Naftan. How can a single node shake three different markets at the same time? This wave of attacks rapidly changes logistical behavior on the ground. Heavily mechanized units have a high fuel appetite. Under the threat of drones and artillery, fuel and ammunition convoys become more visible. Russian forces have therefore shifted toward more infantry and light vehicle combinations during the summer months. Repeated strikes on energy nodes make this choice more rational. If product support from Belarus decreases, internal market reinforcement becomes more difficult. Let's shift the Belarus dimension from technical to political. Minsk must keep domestic fuel prices stable, while refineries are operational. Otherwise, social costs will rise. Increased dependence on Russia will boost demand for discounts and maintenance support. This narrows Belarus's bargaining position. Its energy leverage weakens. How much longer can Minsk play the energy card against Moscow? The market responds first with a risk premium. Pipeline insurance and freight costs rise. Discounts may widen at export points like Ust-Luga. These discounts reduce Russian export revenues. Belarus, meanwhile, faces more volatile raw material costs. Belarus's refinery economy already operates on narrow margins. If the crude slate changes, product yield and profitability are affected. Planned maintenance is brought forward in the event of sudden flow declines. This also reduces product output. Supply pressure increases in the domestic market. Let's weigh the headline, "Lukashenko in panic," with the data. Panic is read from flow indicators, not from the government's communication. Official statements in Belarus are cautious. Real panic is understood by fluctuating prices at retail pumps, quota sales, and emergency maintenance announcements. There is no evidence of this at the moment. However, the risk level has risen significantly. Belarus does not have many options. It cannot quickly convert alternative raw materials. Swap agreements are limited and costly. Raw material supply by rail is very expensive. Therefore, the pipeline's integrity is not a secondary but a primary priority for Belarus. What is the difference between the pipeline being shut down for 2 days and 2 weeks? The field repair cycle progresses in a technical and predictable manner. The first task is to establish a security perimeter and control the fire. Pressure is then brought under control, and damaged modules are isolated. Backup pumps and valves are activated. After electrical and control tests are completed, pressure is gradually increased. If there is severe damage, the duration increases. Repeated attacks make this cycle more expensive. Each attack requires additional investment in fire safety at the site. Open cable channels are closed, and peak surveillance and lighting are reinforced. Detection and jamming solutions are added to counter low-altitude threats. Spare parts are quickly replenished, which can create other vulnerabilities in the supply chain. Another front is cybersecurity. Pumping stations operate with industrial control systems. Segmentation and manual override procedures are generally in place. However, simultaneous physical and cyber stress can complicate repairs. An ICS issue in Belarus could reduce flow even without physical damage. Therefore, operators are layering their defenses. Railway and tanker truck substitutes may increase in Russian domestic distribution. However, this method is costly. Road convoys also pose a risk under drone threats. Delays increase when railway lines are targeted. These delays also affect product replenishment in Belarus. Because this hub is Belarus's oxygen. Because this hub is the gateway to the Baltic. Because this hub is Russia's export foot. The Ust-Luga outlet is fed from here. Last year, 650,000 barrels passed through daily. This year, the target was set at 725,000 barrels. These numbers speak volumes. These numbers amplify the value of the risk. How does this reflect on the front lines? Wherever fuel becomes scarce, the pace slows down. Heavy mechanized attacks are expensive. Tanks and ZMA require fuel. Convoy security is essential. It requires bridges and roads. If fuel replenishment is delayed, the plan falls apart. The Russian side changed throughout the summer. Infiltration and small-scale pressure came to the fore. Infantry-based operations increased. Motorcycle and buggy sightings multiplied. This choice is no coincidence. Deep strikes disrupted the rhythm. Refineries shut down. Depots were shaken. Convoys hid at night. Drone threats made transportation costly. This friction changed the language of the front lines. Heavy pushes gave way to small bites. We saw this on the Pokrovsk line. We observed it around Toretsk. The same pattern emerged along the Siversk axis. Energy pressure rewrote tactical behavior. Now there are three objectives on the ground. Slow down the fuel flow, strain the transportation network, disrupt export revenues. If all three are hit in the same cycle, the economy will falter. The supply chain will be disrupted. Shifts will lengthen. Morale will drop. Command plans will simplify. The domestic market will tighten. The picture is more complex for Belarus. Minsk is dependent on Moscow. If the refineries operate, it breathes. If it sells products, it fills its coffers. But if the pressure remains, the difficulties grow. Fluctuations begin in the Mozyr flow. The Novopolotsk flow is restricted. Planned maintenance is brought forward. Product exports decrease. Domestic supply takes priority. This also affects prices. It is important to write about Belarus's vulnerabilities without exaggeration. The country has experience in refinery operations and can manage potential short-term disruptions. However, in the event of prolonged and repeated bottlenecks, maneuvering room narrows rapidly. Pressure to provide subsidies to maintain price stability increases. This puts strain on public finances. The domestic political barometer comes into play here. Economic chain effects grow in unplanned items. Emergency maintenance budgets swell. Insurance and security investments increase. Transportation contracts are renegotiated. The cost of uncertainty can even exceed the actual damage. Can uncertainty be more costly than actual damage? The European side is not raising the alarm under the current, as-planned flow conditions. However, price behavior is trend-sensitive. As news of second and third attacks on bottlenecks emerges, the risk premium increases. Even without physical disruptions, profitability deteriorates. For Belarus, this means a cycle of expensive raw materials and cheap products. Let's clarify three scenario sets for Belarus. In the short term, the most likely scenario is a halting continuation. Flows continue, but with small volume declines and timing shifts. In the medium term, the likelihood of partial outages and capacity constraints increases. Refineries bring forward planned maintenance, and product exports temporarily decline. In the long term, if a double-knot stress emerges, the risk of actual cuts becomes more pronounced. Each of these scenarios requires a different policy set. In the first, communication, stock management, and retail price guidance take center stage. In the second, discount and spare parts negotiations with Moscow intensify. In the third, discussions on partial quotas and rationing in the domestic market may come to the fore. There are currently no signs of the third stage. However, trend monitoring requires that this risk remain within the framework. What move would Minsk make in the next 14 days to reduce the risk? Enhancing field security is inevitable. Sensor and jammer solutions against low-altitude threats will become more widespread. Shift schedules and response times will be shortened. Passive protection of storage tanks is strengthened. Exposed cables and control elements are moved into enclosed channels. However, all of this depends on time and budget. These security investments also increase flow costs. Each additional barrier requires new maintenance. Repair teams become larger, and spare parts lists grow longer. A security premium becomes a permanent feature of the pipeline's financial model. Belarus will seek to recoup part of this cost through higher raw material prices. Russia will add its own conditions to any discount requests. The Russian side may increase rail and tanker substitutes. However, this solution also becomes a target. Convoys moving at a constant speed are easy to track for drones. Attacks on rail lines increase delays. Additionally, the cost-time equation is worse compared to pipelines. Product supplies to Belarus may be disrupted under these conditions. The timing of the energy war is also critical. The demand profile is different during the summer months. As winter approaches, heating fuel and diesel consumption increase. Belarus becomes more sensitive to even small drops in flow rates as winter approaches. Therefore, today's repeated disruptions should be considered an early warning. This warning increases the risk of year-end disruptions. Could today's minor disruption turn into a major shock in winter? Field and market indicators must be monitored together. Station-based pressure and flow rate data provide more clarity than official statements. Tanker movements at Baltic exits reflect discount behavior. Retail price and stock reports in the Belarusian domestic market indicate whether the risk is becoming socialized. Refinery maintenance announcements provide clues about the real technical pressure. When these data are read together, a risk picture emerges that is free from exaggeration. Now let's clarify why the Belarus effect is at the forefront. Because Belarus is not standing alone at the customer end of the line. It is also a safety valve for the Russian domestic market's product balance. As Russian refineries are hit, product reinforcements from Belarus to the domestic market become increasingly important. If a node of unequal scale weakens, this safety valve also weakens. Therefore, both economies face simultaneous risks. Belarus, meanwhile, is losing some of its bargaining power. Kiev's message is clear. The fuel and lubricant network is the target. This statement encompasses not only refineries but also pumping stations. Attacks on the hubs strain the maintenance and repair ecosystem. At a certain point, operators reduce flow rates to protect the most vulnerable module. This behavior directly impacts Belarus. The question of, has it been cut or not, is intriguing but narrow. The right question should be, is node stress turning into a permanent cost? And how quickly can Belarus absorb it? The current answer is cautious. Yes, stress is increasing. Yes, Belarus can absorb it, but at a higher cost and under riskier conditions. If this trend continues, Minsk's bargaining power will diminish. Defending the domestic market will become more difficult, and the regional energy equation will lock into a new level. Reversing this requires reducing the frequency of attacks and rapidly expanding repair security capacity. Thank you for watching.
Stories now, and Donald Trump says he believes Vladimir Putin is ready to make a deal.
And they're going to be on an airbase just outside of Anchorage, Alaska, not too far from where we're standing right now.
The front line did not break, but the Kremlin's dreams were shaken. Hours before the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, Russia made a quick attempt to advance in Donetsk. A 10-kilometer advance along the Dobropilya-Pokrovsk line was quickly halted. At the same time, the Lukoil refinery in Volgograd was set ablaze by a Ukrainian drone attack. These two developments, the front line being held and the drone hitting its target, undermined Moscow's pre-summit narrative that it had the upper hand. European capitals were clear. No territorial concessions, only security and reconstruction can be discussed. Can Putin walk away from this table with something to show for it, or will Alaska be a new dead end for him? The move the Russians tried in the direction of Dobropilya was familiar in form, but unusual in tempo. It involved infiltration and build-up through advanced reconnaissance teams and small foot patrols, with a reported 10 to 17 kilometers of depth achieved in 48 hours. This was a relative leap forward compared to the meter-by-meter advances seen over the past months. However, logistics fell short, and flank security was not established. As Ukrainian reserves were shifted to the region, the pace of the advance slowed. The common ground between Ukrainian and Russian sources is as follows. Ukraine is managing to infiltrate some areas, but cannot hold them for long. In other words, it is engaging in hit-and-run tactics and not establishing lasting control. In field terms, there is contact but no control. Therefore, the term temporary setback is more accurate than breakthrough. Looking at the situation on the ground hour by hour, the picture becomes clearer. The Ukrainian General Staff announced that new units and vehicles had been deployed in the direction of Dobropilya and that the line had been stabilized. The Azov Brigade is at the forefront of these units. Russian teams in the region attempted covert surveillance and micro-assaults using tree lines, windbreaks, and village basements. Local counterattacks pushed these small pockets back. Even Russian military bloggers have put the brakes on talk of a quick victory, pointing out that the deep but narrow penetration is facing supply and flank security issues. ISW noted in its August 14th report that the line of control and the forward contact line remain distinct, and that the Russians have not been able to establish lasting control in the areas they have infiltrated. The Ukrainian side did not just hold the line, it continued its targeted pressure on the Russian fuel and oil supply chain. An attack on the Lukoil refinery in Volgograd using unmanned systems caused multiple fires at the facility and raised questions about its production capacity. This facility is one of the largest producers in the Southern Federal District, with a significant share in diesel, gasoline, and aviation fuel. Previous waves of attacks targeting the Russian refinery network since the beginning of the year should also be recalled. Every pump station and cooling tower hit translates into delays in fuel supply at the front lines. The circulation of such images of a fire before Alaska puts Moscow's narrative of power through statistics in an unpleasant political light. The diplomatic calendar is moving quickly. A face-to-face meeting between Trump and Putin at the Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska is expected. Sources familiar with the matter also wrote that European leaders clearly rejected Trump's idea of a solution that would put heavy pressure on the ground. In the same bulletin, calls for evaluating the possibility of a ceasefire and negotiations appear in the same paragraph alongside the statement that Ukraine's territorial integrity is not negotiable. This double language shows that Europe is sending two messages to the table. No concessions, but if the intensity of the conflict decreases, military-civilian instruments will be brought into play to stabilize the field. Indeed, some leaders seem to have theoretically left open the possibility that elements such as training, mine clearance, and air security could be implemented in Ukraine on the basis of a ceasefire. The discussion of a security force coming out of London is noteworthy as an extension of this framework. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's statement that they are ready for a package including an air security component, training and mine clearance in the Black Sea, in western Ukraine after a possible ceasefire, raises Europe's threshold for presence on the ground to a new level. The issue is not, what are we sending today, but rather seeking a technical answer to the question, what are we preparing for tomorrow to prevent the ceasefire from collapsing? This confronts Moscow with a new equation between the benefits of the ceasefire and the cost of Western presence. Why did Russian command attempt this push precisely before the summit? Over the past 6 months, a method has become increasingly widespread on the Ukrainian battlefield. Small teams infiltrate forward positions and then use drones to temporarily paralyze nearby troops and supply lines. This tactic targets Russia's fixed and slow-reacting military structure. However, this method has generally been used to achieve short-term results in areas close to the front lines. The application of this tactic further inland, in the depths of Russian defenses, along the Dobropilya line, demonstrates Kiev's determination to test the doctrine. This is part of an effort to gain field experience and determine which tactics are sustainable where. However, moving deeper into enemy territory means advancing along an unprotected line, which is risky. The image is important not only on the battlefield, but also at the negotiating table. In the context of the Alaska summit and the US's diplomatic overtures, the Ukrainian side wants to show the world that it is still pushing. The move on the Dobropilya axis can also be seen as an investment in media and public diplomacy in this context. Simply penetrating deeply into a specific point does not mean that the entire area is under control. Control and contact are not the same thing. This distinction is very clear on the ground. If you cannot advance beyond a narrow line and remain there, this cannot be considered a tactical success. Without expansion, encirclement cannot be achieved. Without sustainability, supply lines cannot be established. The Dobropilya direction is risky in this regard. The line is narrow, there is a lot of open space, and the flanks are weak. This makes it an ideal target for armored defense and FPV drone attacks. Even instructors with experience from Russian Storm Z units have warned that the flanks are unprotected, indicating that the advance is too linear and vulnerable to flanking attacks. From the Ukrainian front, the plan is clear. Hold the line, bite the flanks, strike the supply lines. As reinforcements arrive, The maneuvering advantage of small units hiding inside diminishes. Shallow pockets are eliminated through drone artillery coordination. This scenario reduces the fear of a breakthrough in the short term, but does not mean the pressure is off. The Russians are continuing their attempts to infiltrate the city with sabotage and reconnaissance teams around Pokrovsk. At the same time, the evacuate and enter model is being tested in the field under intense artillery and air pressure. Therefore, the coming days may not see a straightforward pushback, but rather continuous adjustments and micro-maneuvers. The oil front is accelerating this military equation. The Volgograd attack is not just about the images of fire, it is about the fuel rhythm in terms of military planning. Even the Russian army's infantry-heavy attacks require a steady flow of diesel and oil behind the front lines. Any disruption in the refinery storage pump triangle is reflected on the front lines on a daily basis. This is one of the most decisive limits Moscow faces as it seeks to advance deeper. As the supply chain narrows, the arrival of reinforcements to fill the depth is delayed. Europe's response to Trump's "let's think in terms of territory" remarks is not merely a normative stance, it is based on the broader military logistical picture on the ground. European capitals know that every square meter given to Russia will only serve as a stage for new attacks. The experience of 2014-2022 feeds this conviction. That is why a conditional ceasefire with guarantees is being discussed, not a compromise peace. In other words, before Alaska, it can be summed up in one sentence: there will be negotiations, but no territorial concessions. At this point, the technical question that needs to be asked is, how can the Dobropilya pockets be crushed? The theoretical answers are clear: flank pressure and close-range fire, temporary blinding with unmanned swarms, point attacks cutting off narrow supply channels, and neutralizing contact within settlements through a clear and withdraw cycle. In practice, however, two decisive indicators on the ground must be monitored: the continuity of Ukraine's short to medium-range drone sorties and the Russian side's ability to convert its troop numbers into pistonless pressure. If this ratio remains low, the cost of each protruding arm will multiply. Local successes cannot be translated into operational gains. The Russian internal narrative is splitting into two strands at this stage of the war. One strand seeks to embellish the narrative of slow but steady progress with the depth of Dobropilya. The other emphasizes the need for no rush to victory, but rather resupply and flanking. The second line is more realistic. As Ukrainian UAS FPV and HIMARS pressure persists in the near rear, the Russian army cannot quickly convert its single-line depths into lasting gains. This leaves no map that could serve as a headline for the Alaska table. Putin is heading to the summit not with a narrative of confirmed disengagement, but one of infiltration and counterbites. The Kremlin is trying to fill this void with propaganda and nuclear rhetoric. The Belarusian defense minister's emphasis on tactical nuclear planning and Oreshnik at Zapad 2025 is part of the usual repertoire of loud finger-wagging ahead of the summit. Such overt emphasis is reflexive control, i.e., it aims to provoke the other side into making hasty decisions. The European side is responding to this rhetoric with discussions of secondary sanctions and assurance forces, to drown out the noise with sustainable support and political unity on the ground. While this may increase the defense's maneuvering space, it also raises the social and humanitarian cost. In addition to the goal of holding the line, a difficult task arises: constantly adjusting the snapshot of the situation in urban combat. So why is Europe discussing the issue of military presence more loudly? The answer is twofold. First, there is the historical memory of Russia's ceasefire, rearmament, and renewed attack cycle. 2015 to 2021 opened the door to 2022. Second, any security arrangements established on the ground quickly erode without on-site oversight. For this reason, grey area tasks such as training, mine clearance, and air security are being kept on the table for implementation within Ukraine if a ceasefire is established. The discussion is not about NATO troops on the front lines, but rather about security and capacity behind the front lines. This has a side effect that Moscow must take into account in its bargaining calculations. If Europe expands its footprint on the ground for post-ceasefire deterrence, the window for breathing space and reloading that the Kremlin is hoping for will narrow. This will amplify the question, what did we get, in the Russian domestic public sphere? In other words, Europe's hardening red line is becoming a parameter that narrows Moscow's options at the Alaska table. Returning to the field, 3 practical indicators stand out for the next 7 to 10 days. The first indicator is whether the Russian side will be able to bring new mechanized units into the east of Dobropilya. Without the sound of tanks, this depth will not become permanent. The second indicator is whether Ukraine can inflict daily damage on Russia's fuel supply rhythm with deep strikes similar to those in Volgograd. The third indicator is whether urban infiltrations around Pokrovsk leave a trace. In other words, are these temporary or permanent positions? If all 3 indicators favor the defense, this will strengthen Kiev's hand at the Alaska table. What Ukraine is doing here is classic strategic patience and tactical flexibility. As the Russian army tries to advance deeper, it leaves its flanks exposed. Exposed flanks invite UAS artillery combinations. As resupply becomes more fragile, troops concentrated on narrow fronts suffer retreat losses. This cycle makes local pushbacks possible at certain intervals. Kiev's risk management is based on wearing down the enemy in rough terrain rather than breaking through on flat ground. Moscow's counter-risk calculation is more complex. While maintaining uninterrupted manpower deployment, it must fill the gaps in the supply graph created by deep strikes. As long as these gaps remain, every breach increases the likelihood of a new withdrawal. Moreover, every fire seen on the ground returns as an insurance premium in foreign markets. As the predictability of energy revenues deteriorates, internal substitution mechanisms are strained. The statistics-driven optimism of Russian domestic media is insufficient to mask this operational logistical divergence. The Trump-Putin meeting will revolve around 3 main topics. These are the possibility of a ceasefire, the territorial issue, and the fate of sanctions. The European line can be summarized as no territory. Sanctions will continue until they yield results. If there is a ceasefire, guarantees will follow. The equivalent of this package on the ground is being tested today in Dobropilya. Without consolidation of depth, political bargaining power does not increase. Without political bargaining power, concessions are not made. This is why Europe's recent statements combine a realistic emphasis on a ceasefire with the need to build capacity on the ground. Kiev's dossier on the Alaska table is simple but solid. The line has been held, infiltrations have been localized, and supply nodes have been struck. The accompanying communication line is also clear. Territorial integrity and international law are not subject to negotiation. Calm is not peace, but talks can begin if the attacks stop. This line is also in line with European public opinion sensitivities. The element of assurance that the word peace will not be emptied of meaning is insistently kept on the table. Kiev's internal front will have to pursue 2 priorities simultaneously. One is to rigorously maintain the infiltration stabilization cycle along the Donetsk-Luhansk line. The other is to subject the other side to an economic resilience test in the energy infrastructure war. Success in the latter provides an additional political lever for every tactical adjustment on the ground. The timing of the Volgograd attack is striking for this very reason. It is a reminder of the costs ahead of the summit. The simple answer to the question asked by global observers, why has this push stopped, is this: there is tempo, but no hold. Russian advances are measured in the drone artillery era by their depth as much as their width. If the supply flank is fragile, depth does not translate into gains. Dobropilya is a laboratory in this regard. Teams hanging in a narrow corridor are forced to retreat when squeezed by Ukrainian reinforcements and UAS pressure. To reverse this, what is needed is sustained mechanized pressure supported by wide flanks. Today, that pressure does not exist. Let's connect the conclusion to politics. Moscow's "I'm in control" narrative before Alaska hit its limits in Dobropilya. The images of burning buildings weakened that narrative. Europe has thickened its land concession line and started talking about on-the-ground guarantees after a ceasefire. When these 3 developments converge, Putin's chances of putting operational gains on the table narrow. Precisely for this reason, the Kremlin is trying to expand the psychological arena with nuclear rhetoric and announcements of large-scale exercises. However, this time there is a prepared and coordinated response from the other side. The short-term forecast could be as follows. In the coming week, the Russian side will either try to expand its pockets with a new flanking maneuver or frame the current setbacks as urban infiltration attempts in the media. In either case, if Ukrainian pressure on fuel supply lines increases, it will be difficult to reverse the downward trend. Ukomysevkiat and UAS sorties are therefore becoming calendar-setting indicators. In the medium term, the debate will inevitably shift to the axis of ceasefire or prolonged attrition. If a ceasefire is on the agenda and the pace of the Russian offensive slows down, some of Europe's security force training mine clearance air defense components could find a place in Ukraine. This deployment would mean the price of stopping the war for Moscow. The Kremlin was pursuing visual success at the Alaska table while keeping this cost in mind. The break in Dobropilya dealt a blow to the most critical part of this plan. Ukraine's homework remains the same. Hold the line, bite the wings, and secure supplies. Repeat the phrase, "no concessions, only guarantees" every day at the political table. And tell the public, there are no miracles on the front lines, but the equation has changed. Depth alone is not enough. Sustainability requires backing, and Ukraine is precisely what is undermining this. This is today's reality. Tomorrow's reality will become clearer as this discipline and capacity continue. What are your thoughts on this matter? Your opinions matter to us. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. In a single night, Putin's missile supply chain was shaken. Production, testing, and acceptance chains were all paralyzed at once. What's more, these were KH-32, KH-101, and KH-59 missiles. Each of them was located more than 1,000 kilometers behind the front lines. This was no ordinary Ukrainian retaliation. Ukraine had targeted two high-value Russian factories. One was a testing facility for high-pressure gas systems, while the other was a sensitive production plant for guidance and control units. So how did Ukraine paralyze Moscow's missile industry in a single night? On the evening of August 11, 2025, long-range drones affiliated with Ukrainian military intelligence targeted a helium facility in Orenburg. The facility processes 15 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually, extracting helium used in systems such as the KH-32 and KH-101 cruise missiles. Ukrainian sources claimed that this was the only helium facility in the country. Short-term traffic restrictions were imposed on the local road network. A section of the federal M5 Ural highway was closed, disrupting civilian traffic and supply chains. On the same night, drones affiliated with the Ukrainian security service struck a missile component factory in the Arzamas region of the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. Here, the K-051 Ateletsil navigation system for the KH-32 supersonic missile, BDG-1M gyroscopes for the KH-101 cruise missile, and ASL-1 firing systems for the KH-59 are produced. These are key components of Russia's long-range missile arsenal and are already in short supply. The operation's backbone remained intact because the target was clear. The rule of 1 to 3 attack drones per target was not violated. Multiple platforms in the terminal phase mean unnecessary risk. A small number of platforms targeting the correct modules means a more consistent effect. Lyuty was chosen as the deep target. Thanks to the integration of the global navigation satellite system and the inertial navigation system, deviation was kept to a minimum even on long-range routes. It transitioned to a soft dive in the terminal phase. It targeted critical equipment with warheads in the 50-75 kilogram class. Boba, thanks to its ramp launch profile, deployed without a runway and tested the weak points of the electrical control system with a 20 kilogram payload. The thermal imaging and operator control window introduced in the latest upgrades make it easier to locate the correct panel, cable gallery, and OG cell. How are they managing with such intense electronic jamming is a natural question. The answer is simple. The jamming effect is neutralized by the INS and terminal visual control. Low-altitude flight also reduces the radar horizon. This technical framework fits the nighttime construction preference for low volume but high accuracy. The Orenburg leg was a critical test. 3 Lyuty entered 3 separate weak points. These points were the compressor island, cryogenic lines, and the filling ISO container yard. There was no rush to prevent a major explosion. The aim was to disrupt the test acceptance rhythm, with short but effective stoppages. 2 medium-intensity explosions on the cryogenic and compressor sides, combined with a third hit, trigger the safe restart processes. These processes are measured in days, not hours. In addition, leak tests, pressurization, and inert purge steps are repeated before each restart. At the end of the night, a picture emerges that is of great military significance, but only partially visible to the civilian eye. Even though the facility appears to be operating, quality cycles on the production and testing side fall behind. The information that the target in Orenburg was a helium facility was provided by Ukrainian intelligence sources. On the same night, official statements were made regarding drone jamming across the country. The answer to the question, "Is helium really that important?" is clear. Helium is the silent but essential gas of the rocket and missile world. It pressurizes fuel and oxidizer tanks. It safely performs the inert purge of lines and tanks. It makes leaks visible in leak tests. It circulates without contamination because it remains inert even under cryogenic conditions. For this reason, it is the standard pressurizing and purge medium in many engine line designs. There are alternatives, but they do not work with the same efficiency and safety. This scientific framework has been described for years in open technical literature and agency statements. Therefore, even a short interruption in the helium line is enough to disrupt the test acceptance cycle. This is what Orenburg's move was playing on. The aim was to disrupt the rhythm by disrupting the verification steps, not production. In this context, the question arises, but doesn't Russia have liquid helium production in Amur? Can't it cover the shortfall from there? Amur GPP has announced regular shipments via ISO containers since 2023. This technically weakens Orenburg's position as the sole source. However, shifting the supply source increases friction. Distance, insurance, internal transportation, purity pressure regimes, and quality acceptance synchronization. This means delays in the delivery schedule. That's how the engineering worked at night. The Azimuth branch focused on guidance and precision electronics. 2 Liuchi were sufficient. The goal here was not to pour concrete, but to shake the calibration accuracy. The claim that the facility is linked to control gyroscope equipment used in the KH-32 and KH-101 families has been circulating for some time. Sanctions lists and open-source product portfolios support this match. That night, the regional governor reported 1 dead and 2 injured. This indicated that the shift schedule was active and the calibration acceptance chain was caught in action. For those asking, what difference does 1 or 2 hits make? The answer is clear. If the cleanroom regime is compromised, smoke and fire suppression residues enter the room, and revalidating the same room can take weeks. Stabilizing the accuracy level of an IMU is harder than rebuilding a wall. That was the goal for the night. In the Nizhny industrial belt, the Boba trio was deployed to expand the defense horizontally. An OG cell, a control cabin, and a short cable gallery were selected. The loads remained in the 20-kilogram class. The goal was not to measure failures in hours. The goal was to open the entrance window for the Lutis to the Azimuth and Orenburg axes that same night. The question, how much space does the 3 Boba defense take up, is not an exaggeration. At low altitudes, the radar horizon detection window is pushed to the last minute. The density of turreted and roofed pantsirs around Moscow is well known, but it is expensive to set up the same thickness of umbrella in the provinces. On the same night, multiple UAV announcements on the Moscow, Tula, and Nizhny axes showed that defense resources were divided horizontally. The cost asymmetry is simple. Cheap attack vehicles wear down expensive interceptors in terms of time and stock. The pressure of the night came from here. We have clarified the tactical framework up to this point. But why are 2 veins so strained with so few vehicles? The answer lies in the nature of verification and acceptance. If there is no helium, testing waits. If the calibration room is contaminated, acceptance waits. If acceptance waits, delivery waits. If delivery waits, the salvo waits. This chain extends ring by ring. A single night's delay disrupts a week's plan. The Russian side highlights the number of downed UAVs the next day, but small deviations in the delivery schedule are reflected in the public eye without being calculated. This is where the political value of this night comes from. The aim is to put pressure on the planning cycle. Let's ask, but what will this pressure cost Putin? Before answering, Let's look at the production environment and economic ground. Russia has ramped up its production of missiles and long-range munitions over the past 2 years. This is indicated by both evidence on the ground and open-source statistics. But this production surge is not unlimited. Most subsystems rely on microelectronics, optics, bearings, CNC machining, and software-controlled equipment. Some of these areas still rely on imports, and China's weight in import channels is obvious. The US and the EU have launched waves of sanctions covering Chinese companies starting in 2024, with machine tools and microelectronics being particularly targeted. Open-source analyses and official statements indicate that in the final quarter of 2023, the majority of Russia's machine tool imports originated from China, with China's share in the microelectronics sector reaching 90%. Efforts were made to slow this trend in 2024 and 2025. The EU also listed Chinese companies in its 14th and subsequent packages. Nevertheless, trade data showed that total China-Russia trade reached a record high in 2024. There are signs of a slowdown in the first months of 2025, but the overall picture continues to be one of substitution from China. The question is, will this line repair every break in the production testing acceptance rhythm immediately? The answer is often no, because it's not just about parts, it's also about processes and verification. That was precisely the target of the night. How does Russia's labor force picture affect this rhythm? In 2025, official unemployment fell to 0.3%. This looks like a nice indicator, but in practice, it means that it is impossible to find workers. The central bank and members of the government have spoken openly about labor shortages. Wages have risen, inflationary pressures have increased, and companies have tried to increase productivity by investing in equipment. But productivity gains take time. At the same time, pressures have emerged on the migrant workforce. In some provinces, security and registration regulations for migrants have tightened, causing bottlenecks in the supply chain, from logistics to retail and construction. On top of that, the war economy has absorbed young workers who are increasingly enlisting in military contracts or the defense sector, leaving gaps in civilian production. Naturally, the directive to increase production collided with the reality of finding qualified workers. This scenario also applies to sensitive production and calibration tasks. You cannot find the same skill set in every province. Therefore, Artemis-type localized damage prolongs the recovery process, even if the facility remains operational, due to a shortage of qualified workers. Accompanying fake unbranded transport networks and route shifts have also been reported. The Russian side denies these allegations, but Korean markings have been discussed on some missile debris believed to have been fired at Ukrainian cities. Will North Korea's ammunition flow replace the calibration helium line that was hit during the night? These are not substitutes, but parallel arms. They can inflate ammunition stocks, but they do not solve the electronic calibration and test acceptance bottlenecks. So the areas hit by Artemis and Orenburg cannot be repaired with North Korean shipments. They only expand the ready-to-use ammunition pool. The strategic balance here is different. Another broad window is the ripple effect of the drone campaign targeting energy infrastructure on production and logistics. Starting in 2024, attacks on refineries and storage facilities periodically took a significant portion of Russian refining capacity offline. The shutdown of facilities like Ryazan and Novokuybishevsk in the summer of 2025 created price and supply pressures in the domestic market and triggered shifts in crude oil export plans. Such energy shocks are not merely economic indicators, they also affect all heating, cooling, energy quality parameters in military production. Production testing acceptance cycles require stable energy. A faulty line is as damaging as an acceptance room hit by night. Therefore, the window opened by Artemis and Orenburg becomes more meaningful when read alongside the energy pressures of the same year. The rhythm becomes fragile. Can China and North Korea close this gap together? The Chinese line is critical in machine tools, microelectronics, optical subsystems, and chemical inputs. The North Korean line can provide volume in artillery shells and short to medium-range missile systems. Together, they maintain Russia's firepower on the ground. However, they cannot repair the fractures on the verification and acceptance axis on their own. This is because verification is inevitably carried out on site, with qualified personnel and under specific cleanliness and energy regimes. Here, Russia's limitations due to labor shortages and sanctions pressure come into play. This is why targeted strikes like Orenburg and Artemis, even if short-lived, get back on track. This rhythm determines the schedule for salvos targeting cities. Disrupting the rhythm is the biggest gain. The short answer to the question, why can't the Russians stop this, remains the same. The answer lies in low altitude, radar horizon, vast areas, and cost calculations. Towering structures and dense defenses have increased around Moscow. However, establishing a 24/7 homogeneous umbrella over the country's widespread industrial energy logistics networks is costly. Waves arriving from different directions on the same night scatter defense munitions and operator hours. Every downed UAV ultimately consumes a preventive measure, an operator hour, and a radar slice. Russia is responding to this pressure with fake batteries, mobile air defense elements, and tower deployments. But when night falls again, the solution is exhausted and needs to be replenished. This cycle has always given the attacker an advantage in situations where the attacker is cheap and flexible and the defender is expensive and fixed. The disruptions reported in Moscow and surrounding provinces in the latest wave do not change this math. What leverage can Putin pull against this scenario? Let's break it down into 3 points. First, further expand production. New assembly islands, new clean rooms, more shifts. The problem is labor and machinery. The pool of highly skilled workers is limited. The supply of CNC and metrology equipment is under sanctions pressure. China will step in, yes, but installation, integration, and calibration take time. Second, accelerate import substitution. This means R&D and testing. R&D files are also tied to the same helium calibration chain. Third, inflate volume with external supplies. North Korea's arsenal is there for this purpose. However, this volume will not fill the gaps in the quality assurance chain. This is why Russia emphasizes the narrative of successfully shot down UAVs in the defense public sphere while discussing the acceptance room page in planning. Every new wave of sanctions and every new supply restriction intensifies this debate. The war economy accelerated in 2024 and showed signs of cooling in 2025. Wages rose, jobs were available, and sentiment remained positive for a while. But when productivity did not increase at the same pace, costs ballooned. Defense spending in the budget swelled. Inflationary pressure remained stubborn. Supply shocks combined with energy attacks were reflected in the domestic market. Refinery shutdowns in the summer of 2025 caused shifts in import-export schedules. This scenario exerted indirect pressure on production testing acceptance rhythms through defense procurement and industrial electricity quality. In short, while Moscow preoccupied the public with the number of drones shot down, replenishment and production plans were rewritten every month in the background. So where is Ukraine going with this campaign? The answer is to put constant pressure on expensive and fragile systems with cheap and flexible tools. It wins not with occasional big explosions at night, but with repeated disruptions to the rhythm. It works on the helium line, calibration rooms, and energy control nodes during the day and pushes them to the limit at night. It forces the defense to spread out across the country. This necessity consumes ammunition and operator hours. Even every successful interception is expensive and reduces stocks. At the end of the month, the balance sheet is not written by the number of buildings destroyed, but by the number of preventive measures that have come to nothing. At the same time, as sanctions against machine tools and microelectronics flows from China increase, Russia's ability to correct its disrupted rhythm is limited. The result is less predictable production schedules and higher planning stress. Will this vice push Putin into a political corner? In the short term, public opinion will look at wage and employment data. The war economy has managed to keep these indicators in check for now. But as labor shortages become more persistent, the wage inflation spiral will take its toll. Pressure on migrant labor will rebound on the economy. New waves of sanctions will add to the costs of shadow fleets and convoluted supply chains. The burden will increase and productivity will decline. Under these conditions, North Korea's arsenal will give it breathing space, but quality bottlenecks and energy shocks will take its breath away. In other words, an economy defense dance of 2 steps forward, 1 step back begins. It is not the one-night picture that matters, but the one-year picture. The night of Arzimas and Orenburg is a small but critical brushstroke in this picture. Let us also ask the question, has Russia not increased its missile production? How much will this strike disrupt the rhythm of the people? Yes, there is an increase in production. New plant expansions, doubled lines, and increases supported by external supplies have been reported. But the increase is not unlimited. As the gap between planned capacity and the quality acceptance rhythm widens, a situation arises where there is stock but few approved products. Moreover, Western-made components, software control solutions, and precision machine tools still play a critical role. The Chinese connection partially closes this gap, but integration is delayed as sanctions and control lists become more severe. The basic reality remains unchanged. The production page does not win on its own. If the acceptance page does not accompany it, the salvo calendar will again be delayed. If this pace continues, the Kremlin will face an impossible choice: either weaken its defense further or watch the foundations of its military-industrial base crumble. How do you think the process might unfold? Your thoughts are very important to us. Please share them in the comments. Thank you for watching. Russia's fuel backbone is breaking. Ukraine's long-range drone strikes are targeting not only the front lines, but also the refineries deep within the country where engines are powered. 3 red alerts in a month. Ryazan has reduced capacity to half. Novokuibashevsk has halted production, and Saratov has stopped crude oil imports. The collapse of these 3 facilities has directly hit the fuel supply for the Russian military. This is no longer mere sabotage. It is a strategy aimed at collapsing Russia's war logistics from within. Without fuel, tanks cannot move, and missiles cannot launch. Will these attacks bring the Kremlin's war machine to a standstill? Russia's oil refinery network has been hit by coordinated drone attacks in the summer of 2025. The 3 targeted facilities have a combined annual processing capacity of over 29 million tons, and are all operated by state-owned energy giant Rosneft. This common denominator reinforces both the symbolic and functional aspects of the attack. The Ryazan oil refinery, with an annual processing capacity of 13.1 million tons, is one of the largest energy centers in southeastern Moscow. Following the attack on August 2, 2025, approximately half of the facility's capacity was rendered inoperable. The Novokuibashevsk refinery, a key component of the Volga pipeline, processes 8.3 million tons annually, and primarily supplies energy to distribution networks in central Russia. The primary distillation unit at the facility was completely shut down as a result of the attack on August 2nd. On the night of August 10th, Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicles targeted the Saratov refinery, which produces 7 million tons of oil annually. The attack caused multiple explosions and a large fire at the refinery complex. Footage from the area showed flames rising kilometers away and thick columns of smoke. The facility was forced to halt production and cease crude oil imports as a result of the attack. The presence of critical products for both the military and civilian economy, such as unleaded gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, bitumen, and technical sulfur, in Saratov's production portfolio, highlights the strategic clarity behind the target selection. This is because the pace of operations on the front lines is largely dependent on the flow of diesel and jet fuel, while in the civilian market, diesel and gasoline prices are exacerbating inflationary pressures. In foreign trade, the replacement of high-value-added products with crude oil is reducing Russia's income efficiency. In July-August, offline primary refinery capacity reached 4.13 million tons, the highest level of the year, while petroleum product exports fell by 6.6% in the same month. While maintenance cycles and domestic demand also contributed to this contraction, the cumulative impact of these factors limited product supply flexibility. Moscow plans to partially offset this loss by exporting an additional 200,000 barrels of crude oil per day from Western ports, but this will result in a decline in cash flow due to the value-added difference, as it means selling crude oil instead of product. The financial picture following the attacks on the Ryazan, Novokuibashevsk and Saratov refineries is quite grim. Assuming an average 30-day production shutdown at these facilities and refinery margins of $6 to $10 per barrel, margin losses of approximately $80 to $130 million could occur within just 1 month. Additionally, when factoring in technical expenses such as repair work and spare part procurement, the total loss could reach between $200 and $450 million. However, the major costs do not end here. Because during the period when sanctions were imposed, Russia lost approximately $78.5 billion in oil revenue. When this structural erosion combines with the attacks, monthly export revenues dropped to $12.6 billion, as noted in the International Energy Agency's May 2025 report, pointing to an additional annual decline of $4 billion. In other words, while refinery attacks alone may not collapse the Russian economy, the costs they impose on top of the long-term decline caused by sanctions are eroding budget efficiency. The second layer of this chain of attacks on Russia's refinery backbone becomes clear with the targeting of energy logistics, not only at production facilities, but also at transmission infrastructure, such as pipelines and pumping stations. This is because an attack was also carried out on the Unacha pumping station on August 13th. Such pumping stations typically house equipment and infrastructure worth tens of millions of dollars, and repair times can take weeks, depending on the extent of the damage on site. These nodes are critical within Russia's vast energy transmission network, because when refineries' crude oil supply is cut off or slowed down, the entire production chain is affected. In fact, sometimes the shutdown of a single station can disrupt the flow balance of hundreds of kilometers of pipeline. Therefore, Ukraine's strategy focuses not only on facilities, but also on targeting the intermediate links in the supply chain. This expands the impact of the operations. Moscow's rapid repair capacity is a limited advantage here because some spare parts are subject to import restrictions. In particular, high-pressure pumps, advanced sensor systems, and control software are dependent on Western technology, so supply chain delays are lengthening under sanctions. This leads to temporary solutions and operational efficiency declines. From Ukraine's perspective, these attacks are an effective way to weaken Russia's war capacity without taking significant risks on the front lines. By striking deep targets, a constant sense of threat is created behind the front lines. Russia's air defense resources are being divided, and some systems are being forced to withdraw from the front lines. Thus, even if the pressure on the direct battlefield does not decrease, the logistics support line is being worn down. Western intelligence support is increasing targeting accuracy. High-precision coordinates are being determined thanks to satellite images, signal intersections, and field sources. UAVs are flying at low altitudes with complex route profiles to make radar detection more difficult. From an economic perspective, these attacks are putting pressure on Russia's oil product exports, while also increasing logistics costs for crude oil exports. This is because some export routes are integrated with these facilities, which can cause delays in shipments to loading ports. Delays, in turn, increase demands for price reductions on Russian oil in the global market, thereby widening Moscow's discount margin and deepening revenue losses. Additionally, these attacks place allied countries like Belarus under pressure to defend their energy infrastructure, thereby increasing Moscow's burden. In particular, the disruption of crude oil supplies to the Mosir refinery increases Belarus's external dependence and makes Lukashenko's regime more politically fragile. In this context, Western countries openly support Ukraine's strategy because the decline in energy revenues makes it more difficult for Russia to finance the war. However, they are also activating their strategic reserves to manage potential cost pressures in their domestic markets due to fluctuations in global energy prices. The US and European countries are working to ensure supply security by increasing LNG imports and signing long-term agreements with alternative oil suppliers. Russia, on the other hand, is trying to reduce this pressure by developing new export routes. This shift toward Asian markets is supported by long-term agreements with China and India and price discounts. However, the long logistics distances in these markets increase transportation costs and discount rates. This limits profitability. Since the beginning of 2024, the loss in margins, repair costs, and value-added differences has created a burden of between $1.5 billion and $4 billion. In contrast, structural factors such as sanctions and price caps are estimated to have caused revenue losses of around $78.5 billion. The combination of these two factors is gradually reducing Russia's budget flexibility. It calls into question the sustainability of the energy export-based revenue model and makes fuel supplies at the front more fragile. If this pressure continues in the coming months, there is a risk that the decline in Russia's refining capacity could become permanent at a level of 10 to 17%. The third dimension of attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure requires understanding how these operations are intertwined with military strategy and what changes in logistics planning have become necessary. This is because fuel flow and quality are among the most critical variables determining the pace of operations at the front. Diesel fuel is essential for the mobility of tanks and armored vehicles. Jet fuel is decisive for the sustainability of air operations, and gasoline is used in a wide range of applications, from logistics vehicles to trucks carrying ammunition. Therefore, the shutdown of high-capacity refineries such as Ryazan, Novokuybishevsk, and Saratov is limiting the flexibility of supply lines directly to the front lines. This limitation is forcing commanders to narrow their operational windows and rearrange the timing of attacks and defenses. Among the methods Russia is using to close this gap are pre-stocking fuel reserves in areas close to the front lines, activating alternative supply sources, and diverting products destined for the civilian market to military priorities when necessary. However, these strategies are causing side effects in the form of supply shortages and price increases in the civilian market. Moscow is attempting to alleviate this pressure through subsidies in the domestic market, but this method creates an additional burden on the budget. Moreover, these costs are even more striking at a time when energy revenues are already declining due to sanctions and price caps. From Ukraine's perspective, such chain reactions created behind the front lines are a low-risk but effective way to limit Russia's maneuverability without directly increasing military pressure on the battlefield. This is because attacks on deep targets force Russia to divide its air defense systems and logistical resources. This reduces the intense defensive pressure on the front lines to some extent. The fourth layer of attacks on Russia's refinery and pipeline infrastructure encompasses not only the economic and military dimensions of such operations, but also their diplomatic and technical dimensions. This is because energy infrastructure is used as both a tool of pressure and a bargaining chip in international relations. The attacks carried out by Ukraine over the past month in Ryazan, Novokuibishevsk, Saratov, and Unecha weaken Moscow's energy card in its foreign policy and pave the way for Western countries to take steps to strengthen their sanctions regime. In particular, the European Union is keeping the option of expanding import restrictions on Russian petroleum products on the table following these attacks. This could further narrow Russia's export markets. From a technical perspective, the impact of refinery attacks is measured not only by the physical damage to the facility, but also by the disruption of process safety. This is because production lines in modern refineries are highly synchronized, and the shutdown of a single unit can lead to efficiency losses across the entire process, thereby prolonging the time required to return to full capacity. When primary processing units such as the crude distillation unit are damaged, the refinery's crude oil processing capacity decreases directly, and production losses are inevitable until repairs are completed. Russia, however, is attempting to counter this perception by issuing official statements downplaying the impact of the attacks, releasing images of rapid repairs, and striving to present production figures as stable as possible. However, data from independent sources confirm that there has been a short-term decline in production and exports following the attacks. Although these declines are being addressed within a few weeks, they create a cumulative loss in total annual output. If Ukraine continues similar intensity of drone attacks over the next 12 months, Russia may face inevitable permanent capacity losses in its oil refining system. Given the current attack frequency and repair cycles, the long-term loss of 10% to 17% of refining capacity is a serious possibility. This percentage has strategic implications not only in terms of production output, but also in terms of the flow of supplies behind the front lines. A capacity loss of this scale would mean chronic shortages in the supply of diesel and jet fuel to frontline troops. While efforts are being made to compensate for this shortfall through alternative routes, each new logistical arrangement brings higher costs, longer transport times, and increased security risks. In particular, the inability to replicate refineries for products with military sensitivity, such as low-sulfur diesel, is directly impacting frontline performance. However, the technical and financial sustainability of this strategy is now being questioned. Ongoing maintenance, equipment procurement, and the need for specialized engineers are becoming increasingly challenging, especially under sanctions. Issues are growing for technical components such as pump systems, catalysts, and control modules that depend on Western components. Within this picture, energy infrastructure is transcending its purely economic value to play a decisive role in the tactical evolution of the conflict. The level of systematic attacks that will continue throughout the coming year will determine Russia's capacity to wage war, not only on the front lines, but also through the veins that sustain it. In short, before the question of who gains or loses territory, the ability to deliver fuel will determine the course of the war. What are your thoughts on this matter? Your opinions matter to us. Please share your thoughts in the comments section. Thank you for watching.
Получается, из-за того, что с двух сторон отбойники, как бы 3 ряда, вот этот ряд.
Trains are stopped in Crimea. Military convoys cannot pass through Kerch. The bridge is not being dismantled, but the arteries are suddenly spasming. Trucks, wagons, and tankers are being held up. Panic is everywhere. People are in dire straits. because the ammunition supply for the army protecting them has been cut off. Explosives and fuel destined for Crimea are stuck at stations on the Russian mainland. People are looking on with concern because the next alarm could completely close the Kerch Bridge. And both Russian residents and the Russian army in Crimea are aware of this. So, is it necessary to destroy a bridge to take it out of the game? You don't necessarily have to destroy a bridge to take it out of the game. The inability of Russian trains to pass through to Crimea safely, the ban on dangerous cargo, lanes closing for minutes at every alarm, and a single underwater explosion keeping engineers chained to their desks for months. All of this explains how Ukraine paralyzed the Kerch Bridge in just 3 strikes. According to Vasyl Malyuk, head of the Ukrainian security service, the Kerch Bridge is currently operating at limited capacity. In particular, vehicles weighing over 5 tons are not permitted to cross. In other words, the bridge is unusable for military logistics. However, to understand this breaking point more clearly, we need to rewind the film. Ukraine carried out 3 successful attack operations targeting the Crimean Bridge between 2022 and 2025. In October 2022, the first major explosion shattered the road deck. Fuel tankers on the side of the road caught fire. Traffic was partially restored shortly afterward. But the bridge entered a cautious operational regime for the first time, lasting for months. The second blow came in July 2023. The attack was carried out from the sea by the 13th Main Directorate of the Military Counterintelligence Directorate of the Ukrainian Security Service. Approximately 200 surface-type unmanned sea vehicles were used in the operation. Road sections were damaged again, and repairs took months. Fully reopened, announcements always came with a caveat: speed limits, weight restrictions, and phased traffic flow. And on June 3, 2025, an underwater attack this time targeted the bridge's support structure. 2 explosions, each equivalent to 100 tons of TNT, occurred. The confirmation of the underwater method signaled a technical adaptation continuing from previous surface drones. Open sources showed that new routes had been found despite boom barriers blocking approach angles to the bridge. This indicates not the continuity but the uncertainty of the attacks, which has now infiltrated the defense plan. While the Ukrainian security service claimed responsibility for the attack, the bridge was closed and reopened several times that day. The next day, traffic restrictions were tightened again. These 3 strikes solidified a fragile reality rather than causing destruction. Even when we say we are open, questions of how and to what extent began to cast a shadow over every convoy. Repairing the bridge is easy, but who will ensure the risk for that bridge? Even if the bridge appears to be technically operational, another invisible meter has come into play on the ground. Reliability. The true strength of a logistics artery cannot be reduced to the simplicity of, did it pass or not? The trio of predictable passage, acceptable risk premium, and the capacity of alternative routes determines the overall impact. This is why the British Defence Intelligence Assessment in late 2023 was so harsh. The bridge had become a security burden for Moscow. Defence elements connecting air to land and sea to shore were locking in personnel and firepower needed on other fronts via the Kerch Strait. Civilian sector steps also underscored this assessment. The gradual shift of heavy truck and fuel traffic to ferries revealed the fragility behind the official narrative. Is the word open always reliable in military parlance? On the ground, day by day, even hour by hour, alarm closures became the new normal. Closures lasting a few hours took a toll on drivers' nerves more than the bridge's concrete. When a bridge closes twice in a row, the convoy commander changes his plan, not his schedule. At this point, the language of engineering comes into play. Every impact affecting the support structure triggers a reassessment of static and fatigue calculations. This means additional inspections for heavy hazardous loads, reduced speed limits, and new checks after every tremor. There is no destruction, but there is an uncertainty eroding the safety margin. In other words, it is not a part of the bridge that is damaged, but its functionality. Would a military train cross that bridge without an engineer's signature? By spring 2024, the picture became clear. Due to hazardous cargo restrictions, over 2,000 tanker cars were stranded on the North Caucasus Railway for weeks. The solution was to increase ferry and tanker shipments. The message on the table was clear. The everything goes through the bridge era was over. Ukrainian SBU head Vasyl Malyuk stated in March 2024 that the bridge was not actually being used to transport ammunition. with the daily number of trains dropping to 4-5, primarily carrying passengers. During the same period, the OSINT community Molfar reported that they had not observed any freight trains carrying military equipment in satellite images. While some of these claims were dismissed as propaganda by opposing media, the behavior on the ground spoke volumes on its own. So where is Russia's logistics breathing from? The answer becomes clear when following the map along the southern coastal strip. The lines stretching from Taganrog to Mariupol and from Berdyansk to Melitopol were rapidly put into operation throughout 2024-2025. In some areas, complete reconstruction was carried out, while in others, improvements were made. However, these alternative routes closer to and more exposed to Ukrainian fire. In other words, every gain is balanced by another risk. The strategy of reducing dependence on Kerch looks smart on paper, but in practice, it comes with a high insurance premium. Around the strait, barge and boom barriers, smokescreen devices, and close patrol lines have been reinforced to counter surface and underwater threats. The attacks came again. These defenses make it harder to approach, but they don't eliminate the risk. The main effect is to increase the number of guards at the gate and slow down every passage. When you look at the economic side of the map, the word closure actually means loss. When a convoy waits in Kerch, the alternative railway line is not just a line on a map, but a cost curve. Fuel, shifts, spare parts, camouflage, escorts, fatigue. Every hour spent waiting at the dock for fuel transferred to ferries and tankers translates into delays elsewhere in the war. The lanes that open and close with every alarm create an artery that seems to exist and not exist at the same time. At this point, the strategy boils down to this question. Is it cheaper to keep the bridge open or to build a new logistics infrastructure without considering the cost? For a moment, we step onto the bridge. Concrete, steel, and cables. But the war is not about the material, it's about the system. When an underwater explosion raises suspicions about structural integrity, parameters such as hazardous materials, speed, and axle pressure are recalibrated on the railway side. On the road, heavy trucks and fuel tankers are either restricted to specific time windows or redirected entirely to the sea. A bridge that appears open on paper is downgraded to high-risk variable status in planning software. This does not mean you have lost the bridge. It means you have lost predictable capacity. Is ammunition transported according to a schedule or according to tactics? This is precisely where political rhetoric lags behind. Official bulletins quickly circulate the phrase, "Traffic has been reopened," while kilometer-long queues in the summer heat are dismissed as delays. In the language of the commander on the ground, the picture is stark. Turn dangerous cargo back to the ferry, divert military trains to the southern land corridor, and stop and start at every alarm. This is what the British call the security burden. The batteries, radars, and crews deployed to keep a bridge open mean reduced defense at another critical point. Every button that lights up in the control tower means another one goes out on another front. How many batteries are needed to protect a bridge? Let's consider the first 6 hours of a crisis. When the high threat alarm sounds over the strait, heavy vehicle traffic and dangerous cargo come to an immediate halt. Passengers and light vehicles move intermittently at a slow pace. The emergency share from Crimea's internal depots is activated. Ferry terminals become congested, and the tanker schedule is expanded. In the following hours, the southern land corridor increases its role as a substitute. But those routes also mean more surveillance, more escorts, and more stop-and-go traffic. By the 24-hour mark, the flow of ammunition and fuel to the front lines becomes unpredictable. The tactical tempo slows, and fire intensity shifts from hourly plans to daily plans. This scenario is not played out once, but repeatedly with each alarm. A voice of objection will rise. But the bridge is still there. Vehicles are passing. Can't you see? Yes, the bridge is still there in the photo. Yes, civilian traffic continues most days. But the issue is not how many vehicles passed, but what cargo, at what speed, and with what security margin. Restrictions on hazardous cargo, such as fuel and ammunition, the reduction of military trains, the prioritization of passenger-focused traffic. Each of these may seem small individually, but together they paint a larger picture. Functional loss has occurred without destruction. This is not a hit-and-forget strategy. It is a hit-and-slow-down strategy. Returning to the psychology on the ground, the Kerch Bridge was portrayed as one of Putin's personal symbolic projects. Therefore, every alarm is not just a disruption of a route, but also of a narrative. The legitimacy narrative built around the connection between Crimea and the Russian mainland stumbles with every logistical setback. But Moscow is taking countermeasures, expanding the southern land corridor, layering air and sea defenses around Kerch, increasing barge and boom barriers, activating smoke screens more frequently, and managing the passage regime in a dodge and avoid manner. Each of these measures transforms the bridge from a static structure into a dynamic security project. And that is precisely where budget, planning and time begin to be consumed. When we look at the operational results, the picture becomes clearer. As artillery and UAV density increases on the southern front, the railway backbone's shift from Crimea to the coastal strip alters the geometry of resupply. This shortens distances at some points while increasing exposure to fire threats at others. Every disruption in the synchronization between railway transfers and ferry tanker operations means that high-volume fire plans are being pushed back in certain sections of the front. When the hourly rhythm of supply shifts to a daily rhythm, the sound of artillery fire grows fainter. This is why headlines like "The bridge wasn't destroyed, but it was lost for military purposes" are not alone. While some independent and opposition publications explicitly state this, mainstream news agencies' coverage of current events also paints a similar picture of the actual outcome. Another critical detail is the mindset of decision-makers. The road bridge is constantly in the public eye as part of daily life. One day there is a partial closure, the next day there are queues, the next day there are videos. The public does not see the difference between "the bridge is working" and "the bridge is safe." Meanwhile, the logistics planner increases the risk factor after each alarm cycle. Even if the engineer says "controlled passage," the soldier demands predictability. It's not the drop that spills the bucket, it's the rhythm of the drops. And an artery with a disrupted rhythm is considered virtually closed in war. Now let's zoom in. Kerch's fate is tied to the broader supply picture of the Black Sea and Azov routes. As the railway line descending from Rostov to the southern coastal strip assumes the role of a new backbone, the budget allocated for repairs and security is increasing. Backup bridges, temporary pontoons, additional ferry routes, each is technically feasible, but each is strategically costly. Because every ruble invested in one region is missing from another. Every fortification Moscow builds while living with the reality that the bridge is a target at any moment means field evacuation for another front. That is why the UK MOD's diagnosis of security burden is not just a sentence, but a balance sheet line. Of course, there is a counter-narrative. Official agencies are quickly spreading the phrases "opened, closed, reopened." Drivers waiting in the summer heat become the visual representation of the message "civilian life continues." However, the pages are closing differently in the soldier's notebook. When military trains become scarce, dangerous cargo classes are rerouted to ferries, and lanes are closed at every alarm. A planner writes, "We won't assume the bridge is passable," instead of "we'll cross the bridge." The Crimean bridge's current meaning lies precisely in this duality. A symbol for politics, a variable for logistics. And on the front lines, variable means risk. There may not be a single answer to the question, what will happen now? But some facts have become very clear. The Kerch Bridge is still standing, but its function has changed. This massive structure over the Kerch Strait is technically still in use. However, its reliability is seriously in question. Following the major attacks in 2022 and 2023, air threats, UAV and sea drone attacks against the bridge have become a permanent new normal. Today, the bridge is closed to vehicles weighing over 5 tons, and the passage of military convoys is both risky and slow. This makes it a strategic but now high-risk artery in Russia's eyes. In other words, Kerch is standing but logistically paralyzed. The southern land corridor, alternative or new risk? Russia is shifting its focus to the southern land route to reduce its dependence on Kerch. However, this route falls within the range of Ukraine's long-range weapons, including HIMARS, SDB, AASM, and ATACMs. While some sections of the southern corridor are closer to the front lines, reducing the logistics route, the risk of crossing under fire increases. Thus, the alternative Moscow sees as a solution comes with new vulnerabilities. The sea route is expanding, but is dependent on weather conditions and the threat of UAVs. Restrictions on the bridge have placed a new burden on ferry and tanker traffic. Military-civilian transport operations using floating platforms across the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov are increasing day by day. However, these routes are both dependent on weather conditions and vulnerable to UAV attacks. In particular, Ukraine's recent attacks on ports, docks, and moving ships using maritime drones are testing Russia's maritime security capabilities. Even a slowdown in all transportation during a stormy week directly affects troop rotations and ammunition resupply. Engineers and commanders are back on the scene with every alarm. Every time there is an attack on the Kerch Bridge, it is not just missile and drone threats that come into play. Engineers' emergency damage assessment, security experts' traffic diversion protocols, and command-level decision algorithms are also reactivated. The trucks waiting in the field, the slowing buses, and the vehicles nervously turning back onto the bypass road are not just a civilian ordeal, but a strategic indicator. Every delay on the front lines is a window of opportunity for the enemy. When an artillery battery receives its ammunition 2 hours late, an attack is delayed by a day. A defense that was about to collapse is closed. That's why Kerch is not just a bridge today, it's a time machine. Who uses time better is more valuable than concrete. Thank you for watching. The Belarusian economy is under pressure from two fronts at once. The financial sector is shrinking due to EU sanctions. The energy sector is becoming increasingly fragile due to risks associated with the Druzhba pipeline. Households are caught between inflation-eroded wages and declining living standards. Milk, bread, meat, everything is available. But not for everyone anymore. Mothers think twice before buying their children a carton of juice. Young people memorize border maps to flee to Poland. And most strikingly, the people no longer want Putin or Lukashenko. For them, hope lies in Kiev's resistance and Warsaw's free streets. For millions of people who refuse to live this life of poverty under a repressive regime, this is not just an economic crisis. This is the silent cry of a society that has been silenced. How much longer can this silent anger be suppressed? The EU's 18th sanctions package has changed the rules of the game. Previously, messaging restrictions were imposed on banks. Now, a full transaction ban is in effect for 4 critical banks. This change is akin to pulling the plug on the banks, because correspondent networks and euro transactions are suddenly shutting down. The scope of the ban is clearly outlined in legal texts. Belagroprom Bank is at the top of the list. Belinvest Bank is second on the list. Bank Dobrobit is also included in this group. The Development Bank is also subject to the transaction ban. Belarus Bank is not on the list this time. However, the systemic impact is still widely felt. This is because the 4 banks hold portfolios with a significant public sector exposure. Agriculture, infrastructure, and state projects were being carried out through these banks. Now, payment channels are shifting to more expensive alternatives. Ruble Yuan and SPFS CIPS bridges are being activated. However, these bridges increase transaction costs. Timelines are lengthening, discounts are rising, and risk premiums are swelling. Cash conversion periods are extending for exporters and importers. The credit cycle is slowing down due to these delays. The Belarusian central bank is closely monitoring liquidity. Reserve requirements and short-term funding are being kept tight. However, market psychology moves faster than policy intentions. Household demand for foreign exchange could start to pick up again. This is why the term fragile stability is used in banking. The capital adequacy ratio may appear high on paper. However, asset quality must be tested against shocks. Loans directed toward the state carry high risk. This is because repayment depends on state cash flows. State cash flows, in turn, depend on budget revenues. Budget revenues are dependent on the refinery and potash sectors. Potash exports have been under sanctions pressure for years. When the Lithuanian port route closed, costs increased. Alternative routes were established via Russia, but they were expensive. When potash prices fluctuate, budget revenues become volatile. Refinery margins are also constantly changing. This is where the energy front comes into play. Ukraine's deep attacks are targeting oil logistics. The Onicha station in Bryansk has become a symbol of these attacks. Fires and heat traces have been reported on the ground. The Onicha station is a major hub in the Druzhba network. Belarusian refineries' crude oil flow passes through this hub. Mozir and Naftan are dependent on this flow. Russia is trying to prioritize flows toward Europe. However, malfunctions can cause temporary disruptions. Even if there are no disruptions, the risk premium rises. Insurance, security, and logistics costs increase. Maintenance teams are deployed more frequently. Parts and labor costs rise. These expenses put pressure on the budget. If refinery products are made cheaper domestically, losses increase. If they are not made cheaper, social unrest increases. The government often turns to control prices. Price intervention disrupts stock balances. The market is punished with empty shelves. The black market and hoarding rear their heads. The most vulnerable segment feels the impact in the food sector. Food inflation accelerated on an annual basis in Belarus. The share of basic products in the basket is very high. In June, increases of over 30% were recorded for coffee and over 41% for chocolate. Double-digit price increases are also noticeable for meat, dairy products, and fruits and vegetables. Income growth has lagged behind inflation. Despite this, Belarusian central bank governor Roman Golovchenko argued that inflation is not speculative in nature, despite rapidly rising prices in the country. In July, the inflation rate rose to 7.4% year-on-year, exceeding official forecasts. Food prices approached 11%. According to Golovchenko, the reason for this increase is external factors, particularly the rise in imported raw materials and price differences with Russia. Household budgets have become sensitive to small shocks. Credit card use has increased without an increase in interest rates. The intensity of credit card use has put a strain on payment networks. Last month's card outage panic grew. The central bank said it was a technical glitch. The technical explanation may be correct. However, the damage to perceptions persists. When citizens cannot make payments at the cash register, mistrust increases. Memories of queues are not easily forgotten. Therefore, a communication strategy is critical. Transparent data and quick fixes are needed. The Belarusian government is limiting transparency. This approach may bring short-term silence. However, it fuels rumors in the medium term. Rumors are as powerful as reality in banking. Depositors do not wait for bad news. They withdraw their money as soon as they hear it. Deposit outflows are deadly for banks. If you cannot keep up with the outflow speed, the crisis grows. That is why the central bank must act early. Liquidity windows should be relaxed and announced. Collateral sets should be expanded in emergencies. The domestic payment infrastructure should be backed up. System providers' tests should be intensified. Cybersecurity drills should be increased. Stress tests should be conducted on all banks at the same time. The results should be summarized and disclosed, not kept secret. Hiding data shocks amplifies them. Sharing data reduces panic. This simple rule applies to every economy. The sanctions package is also affecting non-financial sectors. New filters have been introduced for dual-use products. Renewing machinery has become more difficult. Automation investments have been put on hold. Production lines are facing risks related to spare parts. Supply through third countries has become more expensive. Delays in the logistics chain have lengthened. Buffer stocks are now mandatory in inventory policy. Buffer stocks tie up capital and increase costs. Cost increases are reflected in prices. When prices rise, demand falls. When demand falls, production slows down. Slower production puts pressure on employment. Even if layoffs do not begin, wages are stagnating. Real wages are eroding in the face of inflation. Households are surviving by depleting their savings. The depletion of savings thins the deposit base. A thinner deposit base restricts banks' liquidity. Banks tighten credit. Credit tightening slows down the real sector. This cycle acts as a brake on growth. The economy's momentum is already low. Reserves are important because the external deficit is closed. Belarus's reserves have been reported high in recent months. The share of gold is a decisive factor here. When the gold price rises, the reserve figure swells. Gold is a nominal item until it is converted into currency. Liquidity quality is not the same as reserve size. The FX component is a more critical measure. Transparent composition analysis is necessary here. Selling gold is politically difficult. The market knows this and discounts it. Therefore, record reserve news does not provide relief. It merely buys more time forward. Time, however, loses value if not used correctly. The rhetoric from the administration is hardening. Lukashenko is saying who should not be given money. This statement carries a message of budget discipline. It is also an admission of scarce resources. It acknowledges that the fiscal space is narrowing. Credits directed toward the state will be reviewed. Projects deemed wasteful will be suspended. The message is that inefficient subsidies will be cut.
These moves may be technically correct. However, the social cost will be high.
There is a small detail here. It is emphasized that the salaries of KGB employees will not be cut.
Lukashenko emphasized that there will be no cuts in the salaries or allowances of employees working in the process of developing the activities of the Belarusian intelligence agency KGB, and that priority will even be given to their payments. This situation is testing the patience of ordinary citizens. Wages in public companies are being suppressed. Investment projects are slowing down. Regional employment areas are declining. Domestic demand is weakening further.
Weakening demand reduces tax revenue.
As tax revenue decreases, the deficit grows. As the deficit grows, borrowing costs rise.
When borrowing costs rise, new projects are postponed.
Trust is essential to break this vicious cycle. Trust does not come from words alone. It requires methodological data and consistency.
The policy framework must be linked to the medium term.
Monetary policy targets must be realistic. Clear communication is needed on the exchange rate regime. The tools to be used to defend the exchange rate must be clarified. Importers and banks must be able to plan. If an exchange rate shock is unexpected, the damage will be greater. The way to prevent an exchange rate shock is through forward guidance. If guidance is correct, panic will decrease. Let's return to the energy front.
Russian crude oil is vital for Belarusian refineries.
Alternative supply channels are limited.
The sea route option is geographically challenging. This dependency turns into a political risk.
Disruptions within Russia spill over into Belarus. Ukraine's attacks exacerbate this fragility.
Targeting each node increases insurance costs.
The bill for imported crude oil swells indirectly.
Refinery margins may not be able to withstand this pressure.
The state will be forced to subsidize margins. Subsidies mean budget deficits.
Banks provide deficit financing. Banks buy government bonds, and balance sheets swell.
Balance sheets become more dependent on state risk. If state risk rises, bank risk increases.
As bank risk rises, funding costs climb. Foreign correspondents tighten limits.
When limits are tightened, payment flows become difficult. Difficult payment flows slow down trade. Slowing trade hits production. As production declines, unemployment rises. As unemployment rises, social tension increases. When tensions rise, confidence declines further. This chain of events feeds the notion of a bankruptcy threshold. However, we must use the phrase, "banks are failing," with caution. This is because no official bankruptcy has been declared yet. There is no evidence of a systemic collapse. This text should be read as a risk analysis. The strong language in the headline emphasizes the risk of the process. Policymakers should not underestimate this risk. Early action reduces costs. Delay increases costs exponentially. A small buffer today can become a large shield tomorrow. The Belarusian government should proceed on 3 parallel tracks. Transparent stress tests should be published in the financial sector. Liquidity facilities should be kept ready for large banks. Deposit guarantee limits should be clearly explained. The domestic payment infrastructure should be diversified. Backup transition plans should be established for card schemes. On the energy front, the refinery maintenance schedule should be brought forward. Critical spare parts stocks should be increased. Insurance policies should be updated and made more transparent. Alternative pumping scenarios should be developed to mitigate the Druzhba risk. Belarus-Russia coordination should be made real-time. Targeted support measures should be designed to soften price shocks on social services. A shift from general subsidies to targeted support should be made. Households with children and low-income groups should be prioritized. An early warning system should be established for the food supply chain. Logistical support should be provided before empty shelves appear. A data calendar should be announced in advance. Explanations should be provided for unexpected delays. The Crisis Management Center should hold regular briefings with the media. Online panic waves should be addressed immediately. Corrections to false news should be published quickly. Options on Belarus's external front appear limited. A financial lifeline from Russia could provide some breathing room. However, Russian banks are also under sanctions pressure. China remains cautious and limited. Gulf capital is wary of political risk. Therefore, there will be no solution without strengthening internal confidence. Building confidence internally is an invitation for foreign capital. Without an invitation, money will not come. If money does not come, the crisis will prolong. If the crisis prolongs, social costs will increase. The medium-term growth story for Belarus has weakened. The industrial composition needs technological transformation. The substitution strategy will fail if it is not supported by efficiency. Efficiency requires investment and technology transfer. The investment environment is not compatible with sanctions. Technology transfer faces legal risks. Institutional trust is essential to break this dilemma. The rule of law is necessary for institutional trust. Respect for arbitration decisions is key for the market. Circumventing sanctions is a short-term solution. In the long term, costly dependencies arise. The economy is managed by reflexes, not strategy. Reflexes do not always produce the right decision. The window of opportunity for Belarus is narrow but not completely closed. Technical dialogue with Europe may be possible in some areas. Humanitarian channels and food security are examples of this. Increased compliance in the financial sector reduces risks. Compliant actors reduce the risk of being placed on the grey list. The grey list exacerbates trust issues. Compliance is as much an image issue as it is a matter of maneuvering space. As the image improves, financing costs decline. When financing costs decline, credit channels open up. When the credit channel opens, production recovers. When production recovers, employment stabilizes. Stable employment reduces political risks. When political risks decrease, new investments are discussed. Belarus's story is in need of such a chain. However, today's realities are moving in the opposite direction of the chain. Sanctions have become more rigid and may continue to increase. Energy supply lines have become more visible targets. Financial substitution channels remain expensive and limited. Household patience is wearing thin in the face of inflation. Migration trends are strengthening among the younger generation. Brain drain is undermining medium-term growth. The share of the informal economy is rising. Informality is narrowing the tax base. The shrinking base is making the budget more fragile. Budget fragility is making banks more dependent on the state. State-dependent banking is creating a cycle of fragility. Time is limited to reverse this cycle. Steps must be bold, while there is still time. Transparency and data quality must be prioritized. Risks must be accepted and a management plan announced. A calendar that minimizes surprises must be drawn up. Central bank communication must be updated and intensified. Coordination with the real sector must be institutionalized. Trade unions and employers must be included in the process. Social buffers should be linked to the policy calendar. The search for external financing should be grounded in a realistic framework. Instead of short-term hot money, institutional partnerships should be sought. The partnership model should include technology and market access. Niche sectors that comply with sanctions should be selected. Green transformation initiatives offer long-term opportunities. Energy efficiency saves foreign exchange. Residential insulation and industrial furnace modernization are good examples. These projects will generate growth if they access credit. Credit requires credibility and transparency as prerequisites. The worst-case scenario for Belarus is clear. Deposit outflows from banks accelerate, triggering panic. The Druzhba pipeline experiences frequent interruptions. Refinery production is reduced, and the budget deficit surges. EU sanctions tighten further. Communication networks narrow further. The interbank market freezes and margins soar. The Belarusian ruble faces a dual exchange rate risk. A widespread emerges in the black market. Price controls expand and shelves empty. This scenario could trigger a chain of bankruptcies. However, this scenario is not inevitable. A second scenario is more moderate. Liquidity windows function effectively and panic is contained. Energy lines are maintained through rapid repairs. The rate of violations of EU sanctions decreases. Signals of compliance partially restore confidence. Food inflation is brought under control through targeted measures. Household real losses slow down. Growth remains low but positive. Budget deficits remain manageable. Individual problems may arise in the banking sector. Systemic collapse can be prevented. The third scenario aims to maintain balance. Mixed measures and selective guidance are implemented together. Reform steps are small, but continuous. Fragile stability is maintained, and confidence slowly increases. Continuity is the most critical word in this scenario. Belarusian politics is being tested on continuity. Crisis management is won, not in the moment, but over time. Economies that use time well soften severe blows. If hard blows are not softened, politics hardens. If politics hardens, the economy suffers even more. Breaking out of this vicious cycle requires vision and courage. Let's return to the headline. The phrase, Lukashenko on the brink of bankruptcy, is a warning sign. Financial and energy pressures are growing simultaneously. Household resilience is being tested. Sanctions are closing loopholes. The banking system is chained to public risk. If this chain is not broken, fragility will increase. If fragility increases, a spiral of bankruptcy could be triggered. Today, there is no official bankruptcy. Tomorrow, preventing this lies in the hands of the government. First, data, then a transparent plan, followed by consistent action. If action is taken, risks can be managed. If not, the warning in the headline could become reality. The clock is ticking for Belarus. Financing windows are narrowing. The energy supply line faces a new test every day. The patience of society is walking a fine line. The economy does not like uncertainty. As uncertainty increases, costs rise. As costs rise, room for maneuver shrinks. A shrinking room for maneuver lowers the quality of decisions. The first principle for breaking this cycle is clear. Predictability is the core of trust. Without trust, money does not flow. Without money flowing, there is no growth. Without growth, social peace cannot be sustained. The roadmap for Belarus must acknowledge this reality. Accepting this reality facilitates policy design. Shortcuts may seem appealing in the short term. However, in the long term, the costs are heavy. Circumventing sanctions is such a shortcut. A lasting solution lies in reducing systemic risks. Reducing systemic risk requires institutionalization. Institutionalization requires accountability. Without accountability, trust cannot be restored. Without trust, the statements in the headline will continue to be discussed. Today, it is necessary to conclude with the following statement. The Belarusian economy is oscillating between fragile stability and acute risk. The EU's 18th package has accelerated this oscillation. Attacks on the Druzhba pipeline have raised the risk premium. Household inflation is being felt in daily life. The banking system is becoming more dependent on public risk. There is no official bankruptcy, but the risk threshold is rising. The path to lowering this threshold is clear. Transparent data, consistent plans, and credible actions. Otherwise, the warning in the headline may one day become a summary. Reason must prevail before that day arrives. Thank you for watching. The Sweden-France partnership uses suppliers from the Netherlands and Italy for optical sensors and LIDAR chips in the ammunition, with the production line under sanctions protection and a weekly capacity of 300 units. Stockholm included a clause in the delivery agreement granting ammunition priority for Archer batteries for 3 years. This reduces Kiev's concerns about stockpiling in its firing cycle planning. The tactical impact on the front lines is more significant than the numbers suggest. When Russian armored columns enter the terrain, they are no longer just afraid of javelin teams, but also of a French-Swedish howitzer battery located 30 kilometers behind, mounted on a truck bed. Even if the tank driver looks at the trees and the line of elevation, the 2 discs above glide silently. No parachute sound is heard. But when the EFP hits the turret cover, a shockwave is felt. Due to this psychological pressure, Russian tank crews frequently hide in the forest, take winding routes, and reduce their speed, despite orders not to abandon the night convoy. ISW reports indicate that by June 2025, the speed of Russian armored columns in the Liman-Siversk corridor had dropped from 6 kilometers per day to 2.5 kilometers per day. Ukrainian reconnaissance drone recordings indicate that most of the delay is due to convoy disarray caused by fear of an overhead attack. The Russian side has conducted experiments under the heading bonus countermeasure, including adding passive composite shields to turret roofs, stretching armored mesh nets, and using smoke generators to disperse roof heat signatures. But since the disk sensor combines heat, shape, and LIDAR return data,
smoke and nets only cause delays and are not very effective in the end. Placing a heat source next to the tank was also suggested, but the EFP's directional explosion still focuses on the actual silhouette. The newly developed Russian Krypta-M jammer was added to the gun barrel and attempted to disrupt the disc sensor with a microwave signal emitted at the muzzle. However, the chance of the bonus shot coinciding with the jammer in the same battery barrel was low, and it was not practical. The political repercussions of the Sweden-Ukraine cooperation became clear when combined with Stockholm's process of joining NATO. The Stockholm Ministry of Defense stated that our support to Ukraine in the form of long-range artillery and smart munitions is preparation for NATO defense industry integration. In a sense, the bonus shipment is a practical demonstration of Swedish industry's commitment to the Atlantic Alliance. It is also strategic for France. In October 2024, Emmanuel Macron mentioned the idea of joint production with Kiev on the Nexter KNDS line. If bonus's performance on the battlefield is confirmed to be as high as reported, plans are in place to establish a joint 155mm smart munitions workshop in the Ukraine-Poland-Lithuania triangle. This would mean local production capacity on the eastern flank. Paris has already provided funding for an artillery maintenance and repair center in Ukraine following Caesar sales, and the bonus production license could be transferred gradually. Russian media claims that Kiev has turned into an open testing ground for Western arms companies. But the side suffering tank losses on the battlefield is bearing the brunt of the psychological strain. Another consequence of bonus is a change in counter-battery radar tactics. Ukraine fires and quickly changes position, and Russian radar tracks the angle and fires Grad or Smerch missiles at the estimated point. But Caesar's shoot-scoop profile and Archer's fully automatic loading mechanism cannot be countered. They change position before they are within radar range. 2 more rounds follow, and the radar cannot locate the source again. This cycle depletes Russian ammunition stocks, while counter-battery fire that cannot hit its target causes minimal damage to Ukraine, tilting the cost-effectiveness balance in Kiev's favor. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is using bonus not only as a tank hunter, but also as an area clearer before critical bridge crossings. In December 2024, 3 bonus shells were fired at a convoy of old T-62mm and T-55M mine clearance tanks of various sizes, as they advanced on a network of forest roads west of Chasiv Yar. Within minutes, 6 vehicles were destroyed, and the rest were forced to abandon the road and leave their heavy equipment behind. The following night, Ukrainian infantry crossed the forest and pushed the dynamic front line back 800 meters. With no armored vehicles left to clear the area, Russian troops tried to clear the minefield by hand the next day, but it took them 6 hours to reach the gap in the front line. Those 6 hours were enough for the Ukrainian defense to dig new trenches. The indirect effect of ammunition is sometimes greater than that of EFPs themselves. Bonus has not yet shown its full potential on the coastal front, as the areas along the Black Sea coast are open and there is little armored convoy traffic. But news of the success of the bonus version with hydroacoustic scanning in Swedish tests is causing excitement in Kiev. If the ER variant is provided, even mobile railway locomotives such as the Crimean Land Bridge Reinforcement Line and the Rostov-Don Tunnel connection could be struck from above. The ER version's disc uses a phased array micro radar instead of LIDAR, can distinguish between metal and concrete, and does not require a thermal signature. The Swedish Defence Industry Agency plans to deliver the first batch of this variant by early 2026. Contract negotiations between Stockholm and Kiev have already begun. Russia's tank loss data is not officially disclosed, but Oryx and Dutch open source teams have recorded 5,913 visually confirmed tank losses as of the end of July 2025. 7% of these are reported to have top EFP traces. Losses on the ground are likely higher. If bonus shipments increase and their use is synchronized with Archer and Caesar batteries, this percentage could quickly double. The number of modern tanks like the T-90M and T-80 BVM is already limited. Soviet-era T-62 and T-55 tanks in reserve have little chance of withstanding bonus. If the Ukrainian General Staff maintains the average of 1 bonus round neutralizing 1 tank, it is projected that Russian mechanized assaults will be significantly slowed down throughout the fall. Ultimately, the bonus ammunition not only brings the cutting edge of Swedish-French defense technology to Kiev, but also strikes at the very weak point of Russian armored doctrine. Unless tank turrets are thickened, active protection systems become fully responsive to direct hits, or APS sensors are updated with a 360-degree upper sensor ring, Moscow will be unable to prevent mass casualties. Production speeds cannot keep pace with losses. Each destroyed modern tank triggers an industrial cycle that takes 3 years to replace it. Sweden's transfer of Archer howitzers and bonus ammunition is therefore not merely a technical matter, but a strategic link binding Ukraine firmly to Northern Europe in the field of artillery engineering. This offensive vector, which strengthens Kiev's hand in the smart artillery age, adds new pieces of heavy scrap metal to the Donbass plains and the Luhansk heights every day. With each EFP strike, the myth of Russian armor's invulnerability thins by a few millimeters. Thank you for watching. This attack profile targets the supply economy, including oil refineries, fuel depots, UAV missile supply nodes, and strategic transport routes. With the strike on a vessel in the Caspian Sea, deterrent uncertainty and an increase in insurance risk premiums are expected along the supply chain used between Iran and Russia. The new sanctions imposed by OFAC in July 2025 on a broad network of Iran-linked shipping companies directly targeted the transportation architecture operating through a shadow fleet and multiple STS chains. There were open-source indicators that some elements of this network were conducting low-profile shipments in the Caspian Sea via Russian and Iranian-flagged general cargo and container ships. Ukrainian sources insist that Olya served as a logistics hub for Shahid components arriving from Iran to Russia. From an operational perspective, the targeting of a vessel at Olya indicates that both the timing and target selection were intelligence-driven. The effectiveness of deep strikes is measured by the chain reaction they produce, with the links in the chain being Iranian-origin cargoes. The Caspian route where this attack, which caused serious damage to both Russia and Iran, took place is the Volga-Don connection, and Russia's supply lines extending to the front lines. The increase in port capacity and storage transshipment capabilities in the INSTC's Caspian branch is the main variable driving the growth of all types of cargo flows, including military supplies. Therefore, every kinetic attack on nodes such as Olya is not just a one-off operation, but triggers a strategic debate on corridor capacity and reliability. The Caspian Sea's closed basin regime, which precludes direct deterrence by NATO or other third-party naval forces, has made asymmetric range suppression one of Ukraine's primary options. In this option, the reconnaissance strike cycle is established through open-source tracking, satellite imagery, AIS anomalies, and region-specific blackout patterns. The attack is therefore not a single loss, but a systematic shadow cast over the reliability of a corridor. Findings from the Caspian Policy Center indicate that unmonitored vessels are increasingly being deployed in the Caspian Sea, creating blind spots for both sanctions enforcers and commercial intelligence. Windward and similar satellite maritime analytics reports emphasize that false identities, multiple STS, and AIS blackouts have become the core methods of the shadow fleet. Due to national law and the 2018 agreement, there can be no third-country military presence in the Caspian Sea. So Ukraine's concept of remote influence and cross-border sabotage UAVs fills the gap where the other side is most vulnerable. This gap requires a more sensitive distinction between civilian and military targets around ports and opens the door to legal disputes after an attack. A cautious framework was presented, noting the limited independent verification of the attack claims, and assessments were conveyed as Ukrainian statements. This caution is partially mitigated by open-source imagery and multiple media reports, but details regarding the extent of the damage and the operational method remain subject to official confirmation. However, the fact that Port Olya 4 is on the sanctions list provides a legal and administrative backdrop that strengthens suspicions of military logistical connections. Ukraine's targeting of ports and terminals as part of its deep strike campaign is part of a strategy to generate off-field costs and disrupt supply chain continuity. Such targeting aims to slow down the horizontal flow between Russia and its front lines via Iran, the North Caucasus, and the Volga-Ural industrial basin. On the other hand, due to the legal status of the Caspian Sea, which prevents the deployment of external naval forces, port facilities and canal transit points are vulnerable areas where maximum disruption can be achieved at minimal cost. The aging infrastructure and seasonal nature of the Volga-Don Canal limit tolerance in the face of such disruption.
While scanning depth targets in the canal and its mouth mitigate this issue to some extent, water levels and sedimentation trends sustain medium-term vulnerability. Therefore, a single hit on Olya could not only affect a single ship, but also trigger risk premiums, delays, and the rewriting of safety protocols along an entire route. While announcing the attack in the hours leading up to its peak carries risks of disinformation and perception management, it can be interpreted as a rational timing choice in terms of political impact generation. Technically, a tactic of creating saturation with multiple entry points and false targets against a port target may have been used. However, the type of munitions and flight profile have not been officially disclosed at this stage. Ambry's assessment that the ship sank to its keel suggests that the explosion fire effect was concentrated in the cargo and superstructure. If the cargo was indeed Shahed components and munitions, a low-density but high-risk chain of combustion explosions would increase the likelihood of secondary damage to port security. One of the most important questions following the attack on the port of Olya is whether this move will trigger a broader cycle of retaliation, whether Moscow will interpret the attack as merely a local threat or as a systematic breach of Caspian security is the most critical unknown in this equation. From Russia's perspective, the first steps to be taken in the short term will include strengthening air and sea defense networks around the Caspian Sea. This could include concrete measures such as radar coverage along the Astrakhan and Olya axes, surface-to-air missile systems, and the redeployment of electronic jamming equipment within ports. However, there are serious doubts about how effective such measures would be in disrupting Kiev's reconnaissance strike cycle. This is because Ukraine has already achieved the capacity to detect port targets from radar blind spots and through satellite tracking. The Iranian side, which is the second target of the attack, may quickly switch to logistical mirroring and cargo splitting methods to ensure the continuity of shipments. These strategies include dividing the same cargo into different ships for redundant transport, diversifying arrival points, and conducting deliveries outside the port using small boats. However, these methods will directly affect the efficiency of the Iran-Russia route by increasing loading and unloading times and operational costs. Following the attack in Olya, it appears inevitable that cargo ships traveling between Iran and Russia will be subject to more intensive inspections. This tightening will not only affect port security controls but also alter insurance companies' risk assessments. In particular, international marine insurance companies raising premiums for Caspian ports or refusing coverage altogether could lead to a greater reliance on shadow fleets. As a natural consequence, there will be a noticeable increase in vessels with AIS turned off, flag changes, or cargo information concealed. However, the Olya example demonstrated that such methods carry critical vulnerabilities at port-based final delivery points. The fact that operational impacts can be created even with a low radar signature attack that is not visible in open sources has brought the need to rethink not only the route, but also the arrival protocol in the supply chain. From a technical and infrastructural perspective, the Olya attack necessitates the restructuring of port security protocols. Additionally, changes will occur in the technical tracking chain following this attack. New patterns based on open-source monitoring will create a new risk algorithm around parameters such as anomalies in port traffic, frequent changes in ship identities, and increased cargo density at Iranian port exits. From Ukraine's perspective, deep attacks provide indirect relief to frontline positions under pressure and disrupt Russia's operational rhythm. From Russia's perspective, the flexibility of the supply economy and the activation of alternative corridors become the main focus of defense planning. From Iran's perspective, the political cost of capacity moving through the Caspian Sea increases, and the sanctions insurance multiplier rises. Of course, here is a short but striking conclusion paragraph tailored to the tone and content of the text. In conclusion, the attack on the port of Olya is not merely the sinking of a single ship, it is a pivotal moment that directly impacts the Iran-Russia supply chain, Caspian security, and logistical strategies. This action, with its profound military and economic implications, declares to all actors that Russia's rear-front comfort is now a thing of the past. Thank you for watching. The Russian army spent months laying mines and traps in critical areas and passageways. But Ukraine used unimaginable tactics to blow Putin's traps up in his face. Using the enemy's traps against them required great coordination, intelligence, and tactical awareness.
In this context, on August 2nd, Ukrainian forces carried out a demolition operation that looked like something out of a military thriller. The incident was highly dramatic for the Russian army. This is because the Russians had placed TM-62 anti-tank mines on the bridge over the Tartar River. They had prepared to blow up the bridge in the event of a Ukrainian attack in the Bryansk region. They hung nets and set traps to protect the bridge. And in the event of a possible Ukrainian ambush, the Russians would press the button as Ukrainian troops crossed the bridge. But moments later, a Ukrainian FPV drone pilot, using a fiber optic connection, skillfully overcame all obstacles, accurately hit the Russian mines, and blew up the bridge. The strike asset selected for the bridge in Bryansk was a carbon fiber-bodied, FPV-controlled, 3 to 4 kilograms class kamikaze drone. The 400 to 500 grams of explosive material placed in the front section of the body was insufficient to detonate directly. Nearly 30 TM-62 anti-tank mines were placed under the bridge to block Ukrainian advances. These Soviet-made mines, with steel bodies carrying 7 to 8 kilograms of TNT, had the power to shatter a tank's underside. Under normal circumstances, these mines would be activated either by a mechanical trigger system or by remote detonation. But this time, Ukraine started the chain reaction. However, when it struck with precision, it was powerful enough to create a shockwave that would trigger one of the TM-62 anti-tank mines inside the steel console holding the bridge. The TM-62 contains 7 to 8 kilograms of TNT in its body, and the pressure exerted on its fusion element triggers the mine. The chain reaction anticipated by the Ukrainian planners began precisely here. When a single mine detonated, all the other mines embedded in the bridge's structure exploded one after another. In total, an energy equivalent to nearly 250 kilograms of TNT was released. The concrete pavement layer, along with the steel beams, was lifted several meters into the air before shattering and scattering into the Tartar River and its surroundings. According to eyewitness accounts, an area with a radius of 100 meters was nearly completely transformed into craters and debris after the explosion. In footage shared on social media, the FPV drone can be clearly seen gliding at low altitude, then locking onto its target and colliding with its support leg, followed by the start of a destructive chain reaction explosion a few seconds later. With the explosion, the drone camera goes dark, and then a column of flames rising into the sky is reflected in the camera. As a thick layer of smoke rises in the area, only charred metal pieces and blackened concrete blocks remain of the bridge. With the collapse of the bridge, evacuation and support links for Russian troops stationed along a 16-kilometer border strip have been completely cut. The explosion destroyed not only a passageway, but also Russia's confidence in its border defense line. But don't think that an ordinary target was destroyed. This was a Russian defense hub that had been carefully prepared not only from an engineering standpoint, but also on a tactical level. The basis of this operation is Ukraine's drone doctrine, which has been maturing in the field. Kiev has abandoned its Soviet-era heavy industry-based defense concept and perfected the low-cost, high-impact formula with cheap, agile, and smart platforms. According to OSINT sources close to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the troops serving in this region are currently effectively trapped behind Ukraine's front lines. So why did Russia set such a trap for itself? The reflex to protect the border was based on the buffer corridor doctrine, officially announced by Moscow in the fall of 2023. Under this doctrine, a series of fixed defense lines were built along the Bryansk, Belgorod, and Kursk regions. The main goal was to stop possible Ukrainian ground attacks before they reached the border and to create a defensive depth within Russian territory. To this end, anti-tank trenches were dug for miles, minefields were laid, concrete blocks were used to create barriers, and remote-controlled explosive devices were placed under strategic bridges. But this defensive architecture also had a weakness. The geographical structure of the region was extremely limited in terms of alternative passages and logistical flexibility. Concrete bridges built over natural obstacles, such as the Tartar River, serve not only a tactical, but also a strategic lifeline function. These bridges were indispensable, not only for the passage of military convoys, but also for the advance of armored units, the transport of ammunition and fuel, evacuation routes, and even basic lines to rear logistics centers. The bridge over the Tsata was an absolute choke point due to the inadequacy of the surrounding infrastructure. The dirt roads to the south were muddy during the summer months due to sudden rains, making it impossible for heavy transport vehicles to pass. The forest cover to the north consisted of narrow, sloping slopes, unsuitable for armored vehicles. Therefore, the destruction of the Tsata Bridge eliminated not only a transport line, but also the main supply and evacuation corridor for all Russian forces in the region. How Ukraine achieved this cannot be explained by simply flying a drone. First came the intelligence step. Both satellite imagery and frontline intelligence sources were used to map the mine configuration in the area. Civilian-looking, fixed-wing surveillance drones recorded military traffic between the bridge's entrance and exit for a week. Video analytics revealed the times when fuel tankers and armored personnel carriers passed through. Heat map analysis identified the traces of excavation activities carried out by Russian excavators at the bridge's foundation, which helped determine the timing of mine laying. Signal intelligence then came into play, since Russian engineering units used low-power RF firing modules to remotely trigger TM62 mines. Electromagnetic interference patterns were observed in the area. Interference windows confirmed the geographical distribution of the mine array. The final attack plan was drawn up, assuming that there were 3 main drive points on the northwestern leg of the bridge and 1 on the southeastern leg. The target was the corner leg, where at least 2 mines would trigger each other. The FPV drone, equipped with a limited explosive charge, locked onto this leg. The drone's final maneuver, lasting 10 seconds, was designed to move parallel to the ground and then suddenly climb upward, causing the body to strike the underside of the bridge girder. One important detail to note is that the bridge has been designated a red zone by Russian troops since the first year of the war. There are unmanned surveillance towers and thermal cameras, but most of the night vision algorithms are focused on tracking trucks and vehicles that give off high heat signatures. With its composite carbon body, electric motor, and minimal IR signature, the FPV drone was almost impossible to detect on Russian surveillance screens. When the flight speed reached 120 kilometers an hour, the detection window dropped to 2 or 3 seconds. A very short window for a human operator to react, activate an RF jammer, or relay orders to a drone defense artillery unit. When considering why Russia couldn't prevent this, 3 answers emerge. First, the mine network laid under the bridge falls under the passive defense category. While the mine is under the bridge, the RF trigger cannot be jammed with interference because the activation sensor is triggered by mechanical vibration when the drone collides with it. Second, Russian electronic warfare capabilities were weak near the bridge. EW teams were deployed deeper into the front lines to protect critical radar domes in Belgorod and Kursk. This rural area of Bryansk was primarily a transit point for ground convoys. Air defense was a low priority. Third, the Russian army adopted a modular corridor approach instead of a comprehensive surveillance network, so sensor data does not flow to a simultaneous command center. Each bridge is under the responsibility of a separate unit. Different regiments carry different EW codes. In such fragmented networks, opening a window for rapid reaction is nearly impossible. Looking at the impact of the attack on the front lines, logistical delays are already being felt. Russia was moving an average of 300 tons of fuel and ammunition per day through Bryansk before the bridge was destroyed. In the first 48 hours after the explosion, shipments fell to almost zero. Alternative routes offer 2 different bypasses, via Klintsy in the north and around Starodub in the south. But both routes are longer and have been marked as sensitive areas since previous Ukrainian drone attacks. The first figures included in ISW's daily frontline report indicate that approximately 5 Russian units have shifted positions along the Bryansk border under the pretext of a tactical withdrawal. In reality, this is not a withdrawal, but an inability to hold positions due to supply shortages. If the fuel convoy cannot arrive, the 6 soldiers inside the BMP-3 cannot maintain the fire support line. When ammunition trucks are delayed, it becomes impossible to defend 122mm artillery positions with AK-74 rifle fire. The psychological impact is even more intense. Russia frequently uses the concept of a deep rear in its propaganda. Regions close to Moscow, key bridges behind the front lines, and major railway junctions are claimed to be under absolute protection, out of reach of Ukrainian drones. The destruction of bridges has undermined this claim. Images shared on Russian social media by relatives of soldiers show not only bridge debris but also armored convoys diverted onto side roads. The question, "Why are our mines exploding on us?" has been trending on social media. The economic impact extends beyond Bryansk. The bridges in the border region are the arteries of the north-south logistics axis stretching from the Caucasus to St. Petersburg. When this route is cut off, additional strain is placed on railway traffic between Rostov and Donbass. Railway transportation accounts for 70% of Russia's total military logistics. The destruction of a bridge may seem like a minor setback at the macro level, but if we consider the series of events that took place at the same time, with oil depots burning in Sochi, a tanker station being hit in Volgograd, and a fuel train exploding on the Rostov-Salsk line, the cost multiplier grows. While the cost per UAV ranges from $5,000 to $25,000, repairing a concrete bridge can cost $4 million to $5 million. When multiplied by fuel supply delays and armored repair bills, the damage adds up to a staggering figure. The attack also stands out as a textbook example of Kiev's deep strike logistics disruption strategy. This strategy is based on a 3-tiered attack architecture. The first layer consists of low-cost but high-impact continuous drone attacks. FPV and fixed-wing kamikaze UAVs are sent in waves to targets behind the front lines. These attacks are often carried out with decoy UAVs to confuse air defenses and force them to overreact. As a result, the Russian defense system becomes unable to distinguish which threats are real. The second layer is the precision strike phase, where high-precision guided munitions come into play. Western systems such as JDAM-ER, Storm Shadow, and Scalp-EG target critical infrastructure such as radar towers, fuel tanks, bridges, and command centers. The third layer consists of electronic warfare-supported signal jamming operations. Jamming systems such as Nemesis, Bukovel, and Thor in Ukraine's infantry blind the radars of Russian surface-to-air missile batteries, facilitating the previous 2 layers' targets. This 3-tiered structure was applied exactly in the attack on the bridge over the Tsata River in Bryansk. Electronic warfare assets near the Ukrainian border prevented Russian EW units from tracking the drone's routes and taking countermeasures. The FPV drone then targeted Russian anti-tank mines placed directly on the bridge's support columns. The force of the explosion came from both the munitions and the chain reaction. The invisible aspect of the operation is the drone technology itself. Several Ukrainian startup companies have produced semi-artificial intelligence control software for FPV drones. The operator manually flies the drone until the final approach. In the last 15 meters, the internal LIDAR and optical matching systems kick in. The artificial neural network identifies the weakest point of the bridge's structure and sends a confirmation signal to the pilot. This minimizes factors such as signal delay and wind drift. No matter how small the target, the drone hits its final point, known as the laser, with millimeter precision. In Russian defense doctrine, countering this is only possible with hard-kill cannons or high-energy lasers. However, Russia's Pantsir S-1 batteries experience delays when firing 30mm cannon shells even if they detect a 1kg FPV drone, and if the detection-to-fire window is less than 2 seconds, the artillery response cannot keep up. High-energy lasers are still in the prototype stage. This technological asymmetry is directly reflected in Putin's image. The most critical component of the military modernization narrative that the Kremlin has been building for years is air defense. Platforms such as the S-400 Triumph, Pantsir, Tor M2 and Baikal radar were lined up like decorations in parades. Now, images of FPV drones costing a few $1,000s slipping through the S-400's blind spot and disrupting Russia's own mine system are undermining the triumph narrative on the ground. What is devastating for the Russian public is not so much the magnitude of the loss as the fact that the trap has backfired on its creator. The long-term equation that will result from the bridge destruction may force Russia to question its mine trench defense doctrine. When combined with the bridge, the mine protecting the shelter becomes a potential bomb ready to explode. Moscow will either reduce the number of mines This will open the way for Ukrainian ground forces, or else a bridge system with more steel-plated mines will be needed, which will increase costs and extend construction time. The rule of military engineering that protection, if it lacks flexibility, backfires, is being added as a footnote to Russia's Bryansk lesson. Finally, we must address Putin's political image. A regime that bases its legitimacy on the strategic control myth must rewrite its narrative when it loses a bridge due to its own mine plan. Let's end with a pertinent question. If the Kremlin's mine explodes on the border bridge, who will defend the watchtowers in Moscow? Public perception is embracing the narrative of disaster rather than explaining the failure. Russian history is familiar with the smell of gunpowder from military mistakes, from the Afghanistan trauma to the Chechnya fiasco. But this time, the mistake is not exploding on the front lines, but in the backyard. The smell of gunpowder at home is too strong to be suppressed by any propaganda. The destroyed bridge in Bryansk is not just a pile of concrete and steel. It is a living monument to the defeat of a costly legacy of defense by a wave of cheap and clever attacks in the old-new war equation. Ukraine made Russia pay for this with an FPV drone. Russia fell into the trap it had set by laying mines. The war will continue, but now everyone knows that the side that can bomb the red lines on the map, not on the battlefield, will win the game. Thank you for watching.
Russia's southern front plans were thrown into disarray by a single bombing order. The Ukrainian Air Force destroyed a vital border crossing in Zaporizhia with JDAM-ER bombs dropped from MiG-29s. This crossing was not just a bridge, it was the military backbone connecting Crimea, Mariupol, and Dnipro. Now that backbone has been broken. Munition shipments have stopped. Fuel convoys have been cut off. The Kremlin's summer offensive collapsed before it even began. Can Russia compensate for this setback? On July 7, a Ukrainian MiG-29 fighter jet targeted a vital Russian crossing point over the Karachukrak River in the Zaporizhia region. This bridge was no ordinary structure. Although not the main branch of the Dnipro River, it served as a key link in the Russian army's supply chain on the southern front. Heavy fuel tankers, trucks loaded with ammunition, and armored repair convoys regularly crossed this crossing every day, feeding the logistics line stretching from Tokmak to Melitopol, and from there to Crimea via Kinburn. This route, considered an alternative to the Kerch Bridge, was critical for the transfer of cargo to eastern ports in particular. In the spring, Russia built a temporary but structurally sound military bridge over the Karachukrak to reinforce this route. Supported by concrete slabs, this structure allowed heavy vehicles to safely cross the marshy ground. An average of 230 vehicles used this route daily, with 1/3 of them directly supplying ammunition to the front lines. The remaining transportation handled fuel and food logistics. This is precisely why Ukraine did not hesitate in its target selection. The attack was not a conventional air operation, but was carried out using 2 GBU-62 bombs, equipped with advanced JDAM-ER guidance kits. These bombs were modernized versions of the US-produced 1,000-pound Mk-83. Thanks to the GPS-guided kit added to the tail section and the deployed flaps, these bombs can reach a range of over 70 kilometers and hit targets with accuracy of just a few meters. Normally, Soviet-designed MiG-29s were not equipped with the necessary interface to use these bombs, but Ukraine introduced Western munitions to these aircraft with a special adaptation kit developed in Lviv. The pilot can now see the range and targeting data of NATO-inventoried smart weapons on the cockpit display. This transforms an old jet into a modern precision strike platform. As a result of the attack, the temporary military bridge was completely disabled. One of the factors that made the attack so effective was not only the precision of the munitions used, but also the systematic air defense suppression operation carried out prior to the operation. In particular, the Russian Army's Buk-M2 medium-range air defense systems deployed in the region were disabled by successive suppression of enemy air defenses attacks in recent weeks. Despite having an effective radar lock range of up to 45 kilometers, these systems were either detected and destroyed or rendered blind due to their radar frequencies being jammed. As a result, Ukraine's MiG-29s were able to advance through an open-air corridor as they approached the range to launch JDAM-ER bombs. The second and less talked-about effect of the operation was not limited to the destruction of the bridge. This bridge was not just a crossing point, it also served as a buffer zone, masking the logistics hub of the Russian 35th Corps on the eastern bank. Hidden behind the fog of war, this staging area was now exposed and vulnerable.
Satellite imagery and heat signature data indicate that smoke rose from 3 separate camp areas shortly after the attack. This likely indicates secondary explosions in ammunition or fuel depots. Following the attack, the eastern ramp of the bridge was completely collapsed into the sea, with concrete blocks blocking the inner roadway. This structural collapse not only stopped traffic, but also wiped Russia's critical supply route from Mariupol to Crimea off the map. They now have to detour from Tokmak to Berdyansk to reach the east of the Dnipro. But this new route means an additional 160 kilometers and a loss of time. Moreover, this secondary route is extremely unfavorable in terms of both geography and infrastructure. Consisting of a narrow strip of earth, this passage quickly turns to mud, especially during summer rains. In such conditions, heavy fuel trucks could get stuck on the road, with their wheels sinking into the mud. This is not merely a physical disruption, but a collapse of the logistics chain. Because the fuel needed to reach the tank's tank is being used to charge a satellite phone, used to call for a crane. On the military side, another panic has emerged. After the bridge was hit, Ukraine demonstrated that its long-range JWR munitions could easily strike the rear of the front lines, forcing the Russian Air Force to respond urgently. Su-30 SM fighter jets were moved to the vicinity of Melitopol, and day and night patrol flights were launched on the Vasilivka-Melitopol line. But these aircraft cannot fly above 4,000 meters to avoid entering the radar range of Ukraine's Patriot systems, which are equipped with AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. This limits both their field of view and their attack position. There are patrol flights, but there is no real threat of a raid or suppression. The S-400 air defense batteries are scattered in a rather haphazard manner against this new threat. According to data obtained from satellite images, these batteries are mounted on temporary ramps that are constantly being moved rather than being placed in fixed positions. The aim is to prevent the destruction of all radar and command units with a single hit. This portability brings with it another problem. The radars cannot operate at the optimum altitude. In addition, Russian defense forces have deployed CRBN masking systems to make it more difficult for JDAM-ER munitions to target them. These systems reduce visibility by deflecting radar signals rather than suppressing them, but this appears to have seriously slowed down coordination and the chain of command on the ground. The impact of the attack has been much deeper and more multifaceted than meets the eye. With the bridge out of commission, the Russian command realized that it could not reinforce its front lines in Mariupol with BMP-3 armored vehicles, which were running on low fuel reserves. With the road link cut off, the solution shifted to air transport. The first reflex was to deploy Il-76 military transport aircraft. These flights via Kerch carried spare engine parts, sets of tracks, and emergency ammunition. But this method created two major problems. First, large targets such as the Il-76 are very easy to detect by Western radar systems, which means that the risk of air defense is immediately sky high. The second is economic. Each ton transported by Il-76 costs 3 times as much as the same load transported by truck. The cargo carried by Russia's logistics network on its southern front is no longer limited to ammunition and fuel. The Ministry of Agriculture's seasonal supply line from Donbass to Crimea has also been directly affected. Trucks traveling along this route transported grain, vegetables, meat products and milk to food warehouses in Crimea, returning with empty pallets, crates and waste packaging. But the destruction of the temporary bridge over the Karachakrak disrupted the two-way flow of this route. In particular, large refrigerated trailers are now forced to take a 160-kilometer detour via Berdyansk as an alternative route. Fuel consumption for trucks on this new route has nearly doubled. Logistics companies can no longer afford these extra costs. Many subcontractors have started to report losses. Civilian suppliers are directly sending invoices to the government, stating, "If prices on the shelves in Crimea do not increase by 18%, we cannot cover these costs."